My neighbor secretly hid a military-grade tracking device under my classic Chevy pickup truck. The next day, while changing my oil, I found it. I did not scream. I did not confront him. I quietly peeled it off and attached it to the undercarriage of his wife's luxury SUV. That night, I poured myself a glass of bourbon and watched my iPad as his own tracker led him straight to a cheap motel where he kicked down the door and found his wife completely naked in bed with my own son. But that was only the beginning of their absolute destruction. Before I tell you how a 72-year-old retired contractor dismantled their arrogant lives brick by brick, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that the quietest men always plot the loudest revenge. The thick, glossy brochure hit my solid oak dining table with a sharp, disrespectful slap. I looked down at the elegant gold lettering that read, Whispering Pines Premium Assisted Living. Harper stood over me with her arms crossed over her expensive silk blouse. She was my daughter-in-law, a white woman in her early 30s who had spent the last 4 years treating my historic Washington, D.C. home like her own personal waiting room for a real estate inheritance. "You left the garden hose running again this morning, Desmond," she said, her voice dripping with that fake, sugary concern she always used before saying something incredibly vicious. "And frankly, the house is starting to get that old man smell. We cannot have that when we entertain our guests. You are becoming a massive liability. It is not safe for you to drive that massive old truck anymore. You are getting senile and we cannot have you ruining this property before we even get to remodel it." I looked at her calmly. I had not left the hose running. I am a retired structural engineer and a general contractor. I built half the commercial properties in this city from the dirt up. I checked the valves and locks in my house out of pure ingrained habit, but I did not argue. Arguing with arrogant people is a waste of good breath. I shifted my gaze to my son Julian, the boy I had raised from the dirt, up the boy I had worked 60-hour weeks on dusty construction sites to send to a private university, was currently hiding behind the glowing screen of his smartphone. He did not even look up to meet the eyes of the father who had given him everything. "She is making a lot of sense, Dad," Julian mumbled, his thumb mindlessly swiping across his screen. "You are getting up there. We are just trying to be responsible adults here. We need to think about your safety and our financial future. Responsible adults." That was a rich phrase coming from a man who I knew for a fact was struggling to keep his head above water. But I played my part. I let my shoulders slump just a fraction of an inch. I let my hands, thick and calloused from decades of hard labor, tremble slightly as I reached across the table for my water glass. I purposely tipped the glass just enough to let it slip from my fingers. It shattered against the edge of the heavy table, splashing ice water across the mahogany wood and soaking right through that insulting assisted living brochure. Harper jumped back with a dramatic shriek, swatting at her expensive pants as if I had thrown boiling acid on her. "Look at what you did!" she screamed, her face turning red. "You are completely useless." "I am so sorry," I stammered, putting on the performance of a lifetime. I blinked rapidly, acting deeply confused and embarrassed. My hands just do not grip like they used to. Before Harper could yell at me again, the heavy front door swung open without a single knock. Trent walked right into my dining room like he owned the place. Trent was my 45-year-old neighbor, a wealthy, arrogant white real estate developer who always wore tight polo shirts, smelling heavily of expensive cologne and acting like the entire neighborhood belonged to his investment portfolio. "Hey guys, hope I am not interrupting," Trent said, offering a perfectly white $1 million smile. "Just needed to borrow your laser measure, Julian." Trent walked right past me without a single word of greeting to the man who actually owned the house. But I did not miss the way his eyes lingered on Harper. I did not miss the subtle, predatory smirk he gave her or the way Harper immediately straightened her posture. She ran a hand through her blonde hair, offering him a flirty, wide-eyed look that she absolutely never gave my son. "Here you go, Trent," she purred, handing him the tool from the counter. "Do not be a stranger." I sat quietly amid the broken glass and spilled water, watching the silent communication passing between my daughter-in-law and the arrogant neighbor. Julian remained completely oblivious, still staring down at his phone. I knew right then that there was a foul stench in my house, and it certainly was not coming from me. I did not say a single word for the rest of the evening. The next morning, the sun was just starting to peek over the trees when I went out to my detached garage. I am 72 years old, but my hands are still steady and my back is still strong. The frail old man routine had stayed inside the house. Out here, I was in my element. I slid under my fully restored 1972 Chevy C10 pickup truck on a wooden creeper to change the oil. The smell of grease and cold metal brought me peace. As I reached up to loosen the oil filter, my knuckle brushed against something cold, hard, and completely out of place on the undercarriage. I grabbed my drop light and shined it up into the dark crevice behind the front wheel well. Tucked perfectly out of sight, held tightly against the steel frame by a heavy-duty industrial magnet, was a small black plastic box. It was a military-grade GPS tracking device. A younger, more impulsive man would have ripped that piece of plastic off the truck and smashed it into 100 pieces with a ball-peen hammer. He would have marched over to Trent's massive house and demanded answers. But you do not survive 4 decades in the cutthroat contracting business by showing the enemy that you found their trap. You survive by turning their trap into a noose. I left the tracker exactly where it was and slid out from under the truck. I walked over to my heavy steel workbench, unlocked the bottom drawer, and pulled out my encrypted laptop. What Harper and Julian did not know was that I spent the last 5 years of my career installing high-end smart security networks for casinos. I had cameras hidden in my garage that were so small you could not find them with a magnifying glass. I booted up the security server and pulled up the motion-triggered footage from the previous night. I set the timestamp to 2 in the morning. The black and white night vision footage flickered onto my screen. My blood turned to absolute ice. There on the screen was Trent creeping into my garage wearing a dark hoodie. He slid under my truck to attach the tracking device, but he was not alone. Standing right by the garage door, keeping watch into the dark alleyway, was my daughter-in-law, Harper. She was whispering to him, urgently checking her phone to make sure my son was asleep in the house. I sat in the dark of my garage staring at the glowing screen. My own daughter-in-law and the arrogant neighbor were working together to track my every move. They wanted to build a case that I was wandering, that I was a danger to myself, so they could legally seize my multi-million-dollar property. They thought they were playing a game with a senile old fool. They had absolutely no idea that they had just handed a loaded weapon to a master architect, and I was about to carefully, quietly tear their entire world down to the absolute foundation. I did not say a single word at breakfast the next morning. I sat at the head of my custom-built dining table, eating my oatmeal slowly and deliberately. I let Harper shoot me her usual dirty looks from across the kitchen island. She genuinely thought she was the apex predator in this historic house. She thought she had completely outsmarted a tired, senile old man. I chewed my food in absolute silence, letting her bathe in her false sense of security. The military-grade tracking device was still firmly attached to the cold steel undercarriage of my classic pickup truck. I knew I needed to move that device, but I needed to execute the transfer with absolute flawless precision. After breakfast, I walked out to my detached garage. The crisp morning air felt good in my lungs. I slid under my Chevy C10 one more time, resting my back on the wooden creeper. I reached up into the dark, greasy crevice behind the front wheel well and carefully peeled the magnetic tracking box off the steel frame. Before I did anything else with it, I brought the small device over to my heavy steel workbench. Harper and her arrogant friend Trent thought I was just some uneducated bricklayer who swung a heavy hammer for 40 years. They saw the calluses on my hands and assumed my brain was just as thick. They did not know that for the last 10 years of my professional career, I was the lead independent security engineer for massive high-stakes casinos in Atlantic City. I personally designed and installed surveillance networks meant to catch highly organized international cheating rings. Defeating a commercial tracking device bought off a random internet website was absolute child's play for a man with my background. I unlocked the bottom drawer of my workbench and pulled out my heavily encrypted laptop. I plugged the tracking device directly into my system using a specialized bypass cable I kept for security audits. It took me exactly 14 minutes to completely crack the basic encryption on Trent's tracker. I did not disable the unit. Disabling it would alert them that I knew about their little game. Instead, I quietly cloned the transmission frequency and synced the real-time location data directly to my personal iPad. Now I did not just hold Trent's tracking device in my hand. I had Trent's entire surveillance feed completely compromised. I could see exactly what he was watching on his own screens. I watched the blinking red dot appear on my tablet interface, currently sitting completely stationary inside my garage. A cold, ruthless smile spread across my face. It was time to take that little red dot for a long walk. Later that afternoon, I put on my worn-out sneakers and a heavy winter coat. I took my usual daily walk around the neighborhood. The affluent Washington, D.C. streets were quiet, lined with massive oak trees and expensive imported cars. I walked very slowly, deliberately, dragging my left foot just a fraction of an inch, playing the part of the fragile, declining old man getting his mandatory daily exercise. I made my way down the block toward Trent's massive, overly modern mansion. He had a pristine white luxury Range Rover parked in his sprawling circular driveway. The vehicle belonged to his wife, Meredith. Meredith was a quiet, reserved woman who actually held all the real family wealth that Trent loved to casually flash around our neighborhood. Trent was just a loud, empty suit spending his wife's generational money. I timed my approach perfectly. I knew Trent was still at his real estate office and the street was completely devoid of witnesses. I dropped my house keys on the cold pavement right near the rear bumper of the white SUV. As I slowly bent down to pick them up, groaning loudly to sell the performance of my failing knees, my right hand shot under the rear axle of the Range Rover. I slapped the magnetic tracking device directly onto the heavy steel frame, hiding it perfectly out of sight behind the exhaust manifold. I picked up my keys, stood back up straight, and continued my slow, pathetic shuffle down the sidewalk. The trap was officially set. The poisoned bait was in the water. Now all I had to do was wait for the sharks to start tearing each other to pieces. Night fell over the city like a heavy black blanket. The historic brownstone grew completely quiet. Harper and Julian were upstairs in their master bedroom, totally unaware of the massive storm gathering directly beneath their expensive shoes. I sat alone in my dark home office, nursing a single glass of aged bourbon. Only the soft blue glow of my iPad illuminated my face in the shadows. I watched the digital screen with the absolute patience of a seasoned hunter waiting in a blind. For hours, the blinking red dot remained completely stationary in Trent's driveway. I did not blink. I did not move. I just watched. And then right around midnight, the screen suddenly refreshed. The red dot began to move. I sat forward in my heavy leather chair, setting my bourbon glass down on the desk. Meredith's white Range Rover was pulling out of her neighborhood. I watched the dot travel steadily down the digital map, moving faster and faster away from our quiet suburban street. It merged onto the interstate highway, heading straight toward the industrial outskirts of the city. I followed the tracker on my screen as it navigated through a maze of dimly lit roads, finally coming to a complete stop in an area I recognized immediately. It was a notoriously cheap, run-down motel district on the far edge of town. It was a dark, neglected area known mostly for illicit affairs, hourly room rates, and desperate people making terrible decisions. Why would a wealthy woman like Meredith be parking her luxury SUV at a cheap motel in the red light district at midnight? Before my mind could even fully process the implications of her location, my phone vibrated violently against the wood of my desk. The sudden harsh noise shattered the absolute silence of the room. I picked up the device and looked at the glowing screen. It was a text message, but it was not from a random spam number or a late-night automated alert. It was from my daughter-in-law, Harper. I stared at the screen, my brow furrowing in the dark. Harper was supposedly fast asleep upstairs in her bedroom next to my son. Why was she texting me at midnight? I opened the message and read the words very carefully. The blood in my veins instantly turned to absolute ice. The message read, "I see the tracker moving. The stupid old man is parked at a cheap motel in the red light district right now. Call the police immediately, Trent. Tell them a confused senior citizen is wandering around a highly dangerous area. We will have the perfect excuse to throw him in a psych ward tonight." She had sent the text to the wrong contact. In her desperate, arrogant rush to ruin my life and seize my property, she had accidentally sent her malicious tactical instructions directly to me instead of her partner in crime. Trent. I sat back in the dark, the blue light of the phone reflecting in my cold, unblinking eyes. Harper and Trent thought they were actively tracking my old Chevy pickup truck. They genuinely thought I was having a severe, senile episode wandering around a dangerous part of town in the middle of the night. They were about to call the local police to ambush a confused old man. But I was sitting safely in my home office. The red dot they were so eagerly watching on their screens was firmly attached to Meredith's luxury car. And Trent was about to kick down a cheap motel room door with the police right behind him, expecting to find a crazy old man, only to find his own wealthy wife hiding in the shadows. The sheer magnificent irony of their massive blunder washed over me like a tidal wave. They were rushing headfirst into their own absolute destruction with their eyes wide open. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my bourbon and reached for my truck keys. I was absolutely not going to miss this show for the world. My neighbor secretly hid a military-grade tracking device under my classic Chevy pickup truck. The next day, while changing my oil, I found it. I did not scream. I did not confront him. I quietly peeled it off and attached it to the undercarriage of his wife's luxury SUV. The neon sign of the Starlight Motel flickered unsteadily in the dark, casting a cheap pink glow over the cracked asphalt parking lot. I parked my sedan in a dark, narrow alleyway directly across the street. I killed the engine, cracked the window just an inch to let the night air in, and poured myself a cup of hot black coffee from my steel thermos. I sat back in the comfortable driver's seat and looked out through the windshield. There, parked right in front of room number 12, was Meredith's pristine white luxury SUV. The military-grade tracking device was still firmly attached to its undercarriage, pulsing its location directly to my screen. I did not have to wait long. Less than 20 minutes later, the harsh screech of rubber tearing against asphalt shattered the quiet night. Trent's obnoxiously loud sports car came tearing into the motel parking lot, its high beams cutting through the darkness. But he was not alone. Right behind his expensive car was a black and white city police cruiser, its blue and red lights flashing urgently in the dark. Harper leaped out of the passenger seat of Trent's car before it had even come to a complete stop. She immediately launched into the theatrical performance of a lifetime. I watched through the cracked window of my sedan as she ran up to the two police officers who were stepping out of their cruiser. She was waving her hands frantically, pointing toward room number 12, acting exactly like a terrified, heartbroken daughter-in-law. She was feeding them the perfect lie. She was telling them that her severely confused elderly father-in-law had suffered a massive dementia episode, stolen a vehicle, and wandered into a highly dangerous area. She was building her legal case right there in the parking lot, making sure the police documented my supposed insanity. Trent stood right beside her, puffing out his chest, playing the role of the deeply concerned and heroic neighbor. He pointed to the white SUV, completely failing to recognize that it was his own wife's vehicle in the dim lighting. He was too blinded by his own arrogance and his desperate desire to catch me in a moment of pathetic weakness. The two police officers unclipped their heavy flashlights and approached room number 12, cautiously believing they were about to rescue a fragile, wandering senior citizen. But Trent could not help himself. He wanted to be the star of the show. He wanted to be the man who physically dragged me out into the cold night. He pushed past the officers, raised his heavy designer boot, and kicked the cheap wooden door of the motel room right off its rusty hinges. The door slammed open with a violent, deafening crash. "I caught you, you crazy old fool," Trent roared at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing across the entire parking lot. He stormed into the room, fully expecting to find a senile, 72-year-old man sitting alone in the dark. Harper was right on his heels, holding her expensive smartphone up high, her camera recording. She wanted to capture my humiliation on high-definition video so she could play it for a federal judge the very next morning. But I was not inside that room. From my perfect vantage point in the dark alleyway, I had a clear, unobstructed view through the broken doorway. The bright flashlights of the police officers illuminated the interior of the cheap motel room like a theatrical spotlight, and the scene playing out on that dingy mattress was a masterpiece of absolute catastrophic betrayal. There was no confused old man. Instead, the sudden burst of light revealed two people frantically scrambling under the thin motel sheets, screaming in pure panic. It was Meredith. Trent's quiet, wealthy, supposedly loyal wife was completely naked, shielding her face from the blinding police flashlights. And the man desperately trying to pull his pants up next to her, the man who was currently trapped in the blinding headlights of his own massive deception, was Julian. My son. Harper's husband. The silence that fell over the parking lot lasted for exactly 2 seconds. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a nuclear bomb right before the shockwave obliterates everything in its path. And then the entire world simply exploded. Harper dropped her smartphone onto the hard concrete. The device shattered, but the sound was completely drowned out by the guttural, unhinged scream that ripped from her throat. She realized in a fraction of a second that her husband was not working late at his startup office. He was intimately engaged with the neighbor's wife in a cheap roadside motel. Harper lunged into the room like a rabid animal. She threw herself onto the bed, screaming obscenities, clawing wildly at Julian's face and chest. Julian was crying out in terror, throwing his arms up to protect himself, begging her to stop, stammering out useless, pathetic apologies that only fueled her violent rage. Trent stood completely frozen in the doorway for a moment, his arrogant brain struggling to process the visual reality of his wife naked in bed with his neighbor. When the realization finally clicked into place, he completely lost his mind. The wealthy, composed real estate developer vanished entirely. He let out a roar of absolute primitive fury. He bypassed Julian entirely and threw himself toward Meredith. He grabbed his wife by the throat, screaming that she had ruined his life, that she was a filthy traitor. The two police officers who had arrived expecting to peacefully escort a confused grandfather back to his home found themselves in the middle of a violent, bloody domestic war zone. They immediately sprang into action. They shouted commands that were completely ignored by the fighting couples. One officer had to physically tackle Trent to the floor, driving his knee into the arrogant man's spine to force him to release his grip on Meredith. The other officer pulled out his taser, aiming the red laser dot directly at Harper's chest, threatening to deploy 1,000 volts of electricity if she did not stop tearing her husband to bloody pieces. It was absolute magnificent chaos. Sirens began wailing in the distance as the officers called for immediate backup. The flashing blue and red lights illuminated the parking lot, casting wild, dancing shadows against the brick walls of the motel. Trent was face down on the dirty carpet, restrained in metal handcuffs, screaming threats at his sobbing wife. Harper was being dragged backward by an officer, her expensive silk blouse torn, her face twisted in a mask of pure agony and humiliation. Julian was cowering in the corner of the room, bleeding from the deep scratches on his face, entirely stripped of his dignity. I sat in the dark sanctuary of my unmarked sedan, completely hidden from the madness unfolding just 50 yards away. I took a slow, deep sip of my hot black coffee. It tasted better than any expensive wine I had ever consumed. I let a quiet, genuine smile spread across my face. They had tried to lay a trap for an old man, and instead they had completely incinerated their own lives in front of armed police officers. The fake happy marriages were destroyed. The arrogant alliances were shattered. The trash had successfully taken itself out. I was just about to put my car in gear and drive back to my quiet, empty house. The battle seemed entirely won. But in the art of war, a veteran builder knows that an enemy will always pour a secondary foundation just in case the first one collapses. Suddenly, the bright screen of my iPad resting on the passenger seat next to me flared to life. A harsh, bright red notification banner cut across the digital map tracking application. It was an automated, high-priority alert from my primary banking institution. I set my coffee thermos down. The smile slowly vanished from my face. I reached over and tapped the notification, bringing the full text message onto the screen. The alert read, "Emergency fraud warning. An expedited wire transfer of exactly $40,000 has just been executed from your primary retirement savings account. The funds have been successfully routed to an external offshore holding account. Please contact our fraud department immediately." I stared at the glowing numbers on the screen. $40,000. Gone in an absolute instant. I looked back out the window at the motel room. Julian was being escorted out by a police officer, shivering and looking thoroughly defeated. Harper was sitting on the curb, weeping hysterically into her hands. But this notification proved that their tears and their domestic drama were only a fraction of the real story. While I was sitting here watching their marriages implode, their backup plan had quietly and successfully bypassed my financial security. They had not just relied on a cheap GPS tracker and a fake police report to steal my life. They had already deeply infiltrated my financial fortress. They had found a way to bleed my accounts dry without my physical authorization. The satisfaction I felt just moments ago completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating, and absolute rage. The game was not over. They had just escalated this from a petty family dispute into a massive, calculated financial robbery. I put the sedan into drive, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly the leather creaked. They wanted to steal my life savings. They wanted to see who could be the most ruthless. They had absolutely no idea the kind of violent, unforgiving storm they had just invited into their lives. The morning sun had barely touched the pavement when I parked my sedan outside the First National Bank building in downtown Washington. I did not sleep a single wink after watching my family implode in that motel parking lot. I spent the remaining hours of the night tracking the digital footprint of the $40,000 that had vanished from my retirement account. But I needed to look the bank manager directly in the eye to understand exactly how the vault had been breached. I walked through the heavy glass doors the absolute second the bank opened. I am a man who prefers handling business face to face. The branch manager recognized me immediately. Mr. Davis was a younger white man who always wore suits that were slightly too tight and smiled a little too much. But today, his smile faltered the moment he saw me walking across the marble floor. He looked at me as if I were a ghost walking out of a grave. "Mr. Sterling," he stammered, rushing out from behind his polished desk. "You are walking. You are here. I am so incredibly relieved to see you looking so healthy." I stopped in front of him, keeping my expression entirely blank. "Why would I not be walking, Mr. Davis? And why would I not be healthy?" He swallowed hard, pulling nervously at his silk tie. "Your daughter-in-law Harper was here right before closing time yesterday evening. She was an absolute wreck, Mr. Sterling. She was crying hysterically in my office. She told me you had suffered a massive stroke yesterday afternoon and completely lost consciousness. She said you were on life support, and she needed immediate access to your emergency funds to cover the specialized medical transport." I felt a cold, dark rage settle deep into my bones. A massive stroke. They had not just stolen my money, they had officially declared me medically incapacitated on a legal bank document. She provided documentation. I presume I asked, my voice dangerously low. Mr. Davis nodded frantically, gesturing for me to follow him into his private office. He pulled up a scanned document on his computer monitor and turned it toward me. It was an emergency medical power of attorney. It granted Harper complete unchecked financial authority in the event of my incapacitation. And right at the bottom, next to my forged signature, was the official stamp and signature of a licensed medical professional. I recognized the doctor name immediately. It was Dr. Aris, a shady private practitioner who operated a boutique clinic on the wealthy side of town. Harper had clearly found a man willing to sell his medical license and his soul for the right amount of cash. "This document is a complete fabrication, Mr. Davis," I told him, staring at the fake signature. "I did not have a stroke. I am standing right in front of you. My daughter-in-law has committed severe bank fraud and wire fraud. You will immediately freeze every single account bearing my name. You will lock down my retirement funds, my checking accounts, and my safety deposit boxes. No money moves in or out of this institution without my physical presence and my thumbprint." Mr. Davis turned pale, wiping sweat from his forehead. He immediately began frantically typing on his keyboard, placing hard security holds on my entire portfolio. He knew his job was on the line for releasing that $40,000 without verifying the medical crisis. I walked out of the bank with my assets locked down tight, but I knew freezing the accounts was just playing defense. I needed to go on the absolute offensive. Harper and Julian were sloppy, but they were desperate, and desperate people always have a much darker motive hiding beneath the surface. I sat in the driver's seat of my sedan and pulled out my encrypted phone. I dialed a number I kept securely memorized. The phone rang twice before a sharp, confident voice answered. Kendra was my 28-year-old goddaughter. She was a brilliant African-American woman who possessed a mind like a steel trap. While other kids her age were out partying, Kendra was earning her master's degree in forensic accounting. She currently worked as an elite investigative auditor tracking hidden assets for high-profile divorce cases and corporate embezzlement lawsuits. If there was a single dirty dollar hiding anywhere in the world, Kendra could find it. "Uncle Donovan," she said warmly, "it is early. What kind of trouble are you getting into today?" "The worst kind, Kendra," I replied, my voice completely devoid of any humor. "I need you to completely tear apart Julian and Harper's digital lives. They just used a forged medical document to steal $40,000 from me. I need to know exactly where that wire transfer went, and I need to know exactly why they are so desperate for liquid cash. Leave no stone unturned. Hack into whatever you need to hack into." The warmth vanished from Kendra's voice, replaced by the cold, calculating tone of a predator smelling blood. "Give me 2 hours," she said. "I will dissect them down to the bone." I drove back to my historic brownstone and waited. The house was completely empty. Julian and Harper had not returned from their disastrous night at the motel. They were probably busy dealing with the police reports and the absolute ruins of their marriage. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and sat in my home office staring at the walls I had built with my own hands. Exactly 2 hours later, my encrypted laptop chimed with an incoming video call. I accepted the connection. Kendra appeared on my screen, her face illuminated by the glow of 3 different computer monitors. She looked deeply disturbed. "Uncle Donovan," she began, her voice tight with tension. "You need to sit down. The $40,000 they stole from you did not go to a luxury vacation fund. It did not go to a hidden offshore savings account. It went directly into a corporate holding account owned by your neighbor Trent." I frowned, staring at the screen. Why would Julian and Harper be wiring my stolen retirement money to the arrogant real estate developer living next door? Because Julian is not just a failing tech entrepreneur, Kendra explained, pulling a digital spreadsheet onto the shared screen. I hacked into Julian's encrypted cloud storage. He has a severe underground gambling addiction. He has been placing massive illegal sports bets for the last 3 years, and his primary bookie is a shadow company owned entirely by Trent. The puzzle pieces began to slam together in my mind, creating a picture so ugly and so vile it took my breath away. The affair between Julian and Trent's wife at the motel was just a messy distraction. The real sickness was the money. Julian owes Trent's shadow company $2.5 million. Kendra continued, highlighting a massive red number on the screen. Trent has been threatening to expose Julian to the federal authorities and break his legs if he does not pay up by the end of the month. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair, digesting the absolute magnitude of my son's betrayal. He was drowning in a $2.5 million gambling debt owed to the arrogant white neighbor who looked down on us. But a startup CEO with a failing company could never generate that kind of cash. There is something else, Kendra whispered, looking at me with deep sorrow in her eyes. I found a draft of a real estate contract in Harper's email outbox. They were not just trying to steal your liquid cash, Uncle Donovan. They were planning to force you into a psychiatric facility so they could gain the legal rights to sell your massive 5-acre commercial plot on the south side of town. The 5 acres. That was the prime real estate I had bought 30 years ago for absolute pennies. Today, that land was worth millions to commercial developers. They drafted a private contract to sell your 5 acres directly to Trent's development company for exactly $2.5 million, Kendra said. They were going to sell your life legacy to your arrogant neighbor for absolute pennies on the dollar just to quietly erase Julian's gambling debt. Trent knew about the plan the entire time. He was helping them corner you. The sheer level of deceit was staggering. Trent was not just the guy sleeping with another woman. He was the puppet master. He was holding a $2.5 million axe over my son's head, forcing Julian and Harper to legally murder me so they could hand over my most valuable property to save their own lives. They thought they had outsmarted a tired old black man. They thought I was just a stubborn obstacle standing between them and their survival, but they had absolutely no idea that they had just given me the exact blueprints to their entire corrupt foundation. And I was going to use those blueprints to bury all 3 of them alive. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows across my living room floor when the heavy front door swung open. I was sitting in my favorite leather armchair waiting for the inevitable. Harper walked in first. She tried to carry herself with the same arrogant, wealthy posture she always displayed, but she could not hide the ugly purple and yellow bruise blooming across her left cheekbone. The physical evidence of her violent brawl with Trent's wife at the cheap motel was completely impossible to conceal. Yet she marched into my house acting as if the catastrophic implosion of her marriage had never even happened. She possessed a level of sociopathic denial that genuinely impressed me. Right behind her was a tall, thin white man carrying an expensive leather medical bag. He wore a tailored suit and a condescending smile. Harper cleared her throat, trying to sound like a loving, concerned daughter-in-law. "Desmond," she said, her voice completely devoid of any real warmth. "This is Dr. Aris. He is a private concierge physician. Julian and I have been so incredibly worried about your declining health and that terrible stroke you suffered yesterday. We paid out of pocket to have him come evaluate you right here in the comfort of your own home." I looked at the dark bruise on her face. I let my jaw go slack and allowed my hands to tremble against the armrests of my chair. "Oh my goodness, Harper," I mumbled, keeping my voice frail and gravelly. "What on earth happened to your pretty face? Did you take a terrible fall down the stairs?" Harper clenched her jaw so tightly I thought her teeth would crack. She forced a rigid plastic smile. "Yes, Desmond, I tripped on the stairs this morning. But we are not here to talk about me. We need to focus on your memory." Dr. Aris stepped forward and opened his bag. He looked around my historic home with greedy, calculating eyes. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Desmond," he said, speaking incredibly slowly as if I were a deaf toddler. "We are just going to run through a few basic cognitive tests to see how your brain is functioning today." I nodded vacantly. I knew exactly what they wanted. They needed a documented medical evaluation to attach to their conservatorship petition. They needed me to fail so they could steal my 5-acre commercial property and pay off the $2.5 million gambling debt my son owed to our arrogant neighbor. I told them I would be happy to cooperate, but I insisted on being a good host. I shuffled slowly into the kitchen, dragging my feet across the hardwood floor. I prepared a silver tray with 3 cups of hot tea. but before I carried it out, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a microscopic digital audio recorder. I had purchased it years ago during my casino security days. It was smaller than a matchbook. I stuck a piece of double-sided tape to the back and pressed it firmly under the lip of the silver tea tray right in the center. I carried the tray into the living room and set it down on the coffee table directly between Harper and Dr. Aris. Dr. Aris began his interrogation. He asked me what day of the week it was. He asked me who the president was. He asked me to count backwards from 100 by sevens. I gave them a spectacular performance. I stumbled over my words. I stared blankly at the ceiling. I mixed up the decades and called Dr. Aris by the wrong name at least 4 times. "I am sorry, Dr. Avery," I whispered, rubbing my temples with shaking hands. "My mind just feels so foggy today. It is like looking through muddy water." Harper let out a heavy, tragic sigh, looking at the corrupt doctor with fake sorrow. "See what I mean?" she said dramatically. "He is completely lost. He is a danger to himself." Dr. Aris nodded solemnly, scribbling notes on his medical pad. "It is quite severe," he agreed, adjusting his expensive glasses. "A classic presentation of rapid cognitive deterioration." I let out a weak, pathetic cough and slowly pushed myself up from my chair. "Excuse me, Dr. Harris," I mumbled, clutching my stomach. "All these questions have upset my digestion. I need to use the restroom." "Take all the time you need," Desmond Harper said, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. I shuffled down the long hallway, turning the corner out of their sight. I opened the bathroom door and closed it loudly, but I did not lock it. I stood perfectly still in the dark hallway, pressing my back against the wall. The acoustics of my old brownstone carried their voices perfectly down the corridor. And more importantly, the microscopic recorder hidden right under their teacups was capturing every single syllable in high-definition audio. The second they thought I was gone, the polite medical facade completely vanished. "Well," Harper demanded, her voice dropping into a harsh, urgent whisper, "is this enough for the judge?" Dr. Aris laughed, a dry, arrogant sound. "Oh, it is more than enough. The man does not even know what planet he is on. I can easily certify him as completely incapacitated." "Then do it," Harper snapped. I heard the distinct, heavy rustle of thick paper sliding across the coffee table. I heard a heavy envelope landing right next to the hidden microphone. "Write the official medical report saying he has end-stage Alzheimer's. I am paying you to be absolute and definitive. I need the emergency conservatorship filed and approved by next Tuesday. We cannot wait any longer." Dr. Aris tapped his pen against the table. "Filing an emergency psychiatric hold carries heavy legal scrutiny, Harper. The courts will want to see consistent, erratic behavior. This envelope covers the paperwork, but we need to ensure his symptoms actually match the severe diagnosis when the court-appointed evaluators eventually come to check on him." I heard the sound of a plastic pill bottle rattling against the silver tray. "Do not worry about that," Dr. Aris said smoothly. "I brought something to guarantee our success." "What is this?" Harper asked. "It is a highly potent prescription antipsychotic sedative." Dr. Aris explained, his voice completely devoid of any medical ethics. "Grind 2 of these pills up and put them in his morning coffee every day. It will heavily suppress his central nervous system. He will experience severe memory loss, muscle tremors, and heavy hallucinations. He will not be able to form a complete sentence, let alone defend himself in a court of law. By the time the judge sees him next week, he really will be the batshit crazy old man you need him to be." I stood in the shadows of my hallway, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of their evil. They were not just forging signatures and stealing my retirement money anymore. They were actively plotting to chemically lobotomize me. Harper was willing to drug my food and destroy my brain just to seize my 5-acre property and save her cheating gambling husband from a massive debt. She was planning to poison me under my own roof. I flushed the toilet, washed my hands, and shuffled back into the living room wearing my pathetic, confused smile. Dr. Aris was packing his leather bag, looking like an honest, respectable physician. Harper was standing by the door, holding a small amber prescription bottle tightly in her manicured hand. "Well, Desmond," Dr. Aris said cheerfully, "I think we are all done here. I am leaving a mild daily vitamin supplement with your daughter-in-law to help clear up that brain fog of yours. Make sure you take it every morning." "Thank you, Dr. Avery," I mumbled, offering a weak, shaking handshake. "You are very kind to an old man." They walked out the front door, leaving me completely alone in the house. I waited until I heard Harper's car start and pull away from the curb. The moment the street was quiet, my trembling hands became rock solid. I walked over to the coffee table, reached under the silver tray, and peeled off the digital audio recorder. I pressed play and listened to the crystal-clear playback of Harper handing over the cash bribe and the doctor explaining exactly how to poison my coffee. I looked at the small black device in my hand. They thought they were building a cage to lock me away for the rest of my life. They thought I was a helpless victim waiting to be slaughtered for my real estate. But they had absolutely no idea that I was already drafting the blueprints for their total, absolute destruction. The war had escalated from financial fraud to attempted murder, and I was about to call in the heavy artillery. The morning air was thick with heavy humidity, but my mind was operating with absolute crystalline clarity. I walked into the kitchen and saw the fresh pot of coffee sitting on the counter. Next to it was my favorite ceramic mug, exactly where Harper had left it for me. I knew exactly what she had planned to stir into my morning routine. I did not touch the mug. I did not even turn on the stove. Instead, I carefully reached into my pocket and felt the small amber pill bottle Dr. Eris had left behind yesterday afternoon. I slipped it into my heavy canvas jacket pocket and walked out the front door. I drove my dark gray sedan across the city to a private independent toxicology laboratory. I could not risk using my regular physician or a hospital clinic where the results might be accidentally uploaded to a shared medical database that Harper could somehow access. I needed absolute discretion and ironclad scientific proof. I walked up to the reception desk, placed $500 in crisp cash on the glass counter, and handed the technician the amber bottle. I told them I needed a complete chemical breakdown of those pills immediately. I sat in the sterile white waiting room for 2 agonizing hours. I did not look at my phone. I just stared at the blank wall, calculating my next moves. When the lead toxicologist finally called me into his back office, his face was completely pale. He shut the door heavily behind us, set the bottle down on his desk, and looked at me with deep, genuine concern. He told me those pills were not a daily vitamin supplement. They were a highly regulated, heavy-duty antipsychotic medication, usually reserved for violent psychiatric patients. He explained the medical reality with chilling precision. He told me that if a healthy 72-year-old man were to ingest that specific dosage every single morning, it would completely and violently shut down his central nervous system. He said it would induce severe physical tremors, violent visual hallucinations, and irreversible cognitive damage within a matter of days. It was a chemical weapon designed to literally destroy my brain. Harper was going to drug me into becoming the exact helpless lunatic she needed me to be for the court. I asked the toxicologist to print, sign, and legally notarize the official lab report. I folded the heavy certified paper, slipped it into my leather briefcase, and walked out the door. The charge was no longer just financial theft. It was premeditated, attempted poisoning. I drove straight from the laboratory to the most expensive corporate law firm in downtown Atlanta. I did not need a friendly family lawyer who wanted to negotiate a peaceful domestic resolution. I needed a ruthless executioner. And there was absolutely no one better at burying arrogant people than Vance. Vance is a 50-year-old African-American legal titan. He wears immaculate tailored charcoal suits that look sharp enough to cut glass. He does not take cases to settle out of court. He takes cases to absolutely annihilate the opposition and salt the earth they walked on. I walked into his massive corner office overlooking the city skyline and dropped my heavy leather briefcase directly onto his pristine mahogany desk. Vance did not flinch. He poured 2 glasses of sparkling water, handed one to me, and sat back in his leather chair, waiting patiently for me to speak. I opened the briefcase and laid out every single piece of evidence I had gathered over the last few days. I showed him the fake medical power of attorney. I played the crystal-clear audio recording of Harper handing a cash bribe to Dr. Eris in my living room. I placed the notarized toxicology report right next to the military-grade tracking device I had pulled from my truck. Vance listened in absolute terrifying silence. His dark eyes scanned the documents, absorbing every single detail with predatory precision. When he picked up the forged power of attorney, he studied the signature at the bottom of the page for a long moment. He looked up at me and smirked. "Your son Julian forged this signature," he said, his voice smooth and deadly. He applied far too much pressure on the downward strokes. "It is the sloppy signature of a desperate, terrified man pretending to be a confident one." I nodded slowly. I told Vance I wanted to press charges immediately. I wanted the police to kick down Harper's bedroom door and drag her out in handcuffs for trying to poison my food. But Vance raised a large hand, stopping me instantly. "Do not call the police today, Donovan," he ordered, leaning across the desk. "If you confront them right now, they will panic. They will hire cheap defense lawyers and claim it was all a terrible misunderstanding. They will say you gave them permission. They might even convince a soft-hearted local prosecutor to offer them a quiet plea deal for probation. We do not want them getting a slap on the wrist. We want them utterly and completely ruined. I asked him what the strategy was. Vance smiled a cold, brilliant smile. We let them file the paperwork. He explained, his eyes gleaming with legal malice. We let Harper and Julian take these forged documents and submit them to the federal court next Tuesday. The exact second they transmit that fake power of attorney across a digital network to a federal judge, it ceases to be a simple family dispute. It instantly becomes federal wire fraud. When they stand before the judge and lie under oath about your mental state, it becomes felony perjury. We let them walk into a federal courtroom fully believing they have already won. We let them confidently lock the doors behind themselves, and then we set the entire building on fire. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a profound sense of satisfaction settling deep into my chest. Vance was absolutely right. To catch a rat, you have to let it walk all the way into the trap to reach the cheese. I shook his hand and left his office carrying a briefcase full of loaded weapons. When I pulled my sedan back into my driveway, the afternoon sky was already turning a dark, bruised purple. As I stepped out of my car, I heard heavy, aggressive footsteps storming across the grass. It was Trent. The arrogant white real estate developer from next door looked like he had been dragged for miles behind a moving truck. His usually perfect hair was a frantic, greasy mess. His designer polo shirt was wrinkled and stained with sweat. The catastrophic motel incident had completely destroyed his perfect, arrogant life. His wealthy wife Meredith had kicked him out of their mansion, locked his access to her family accounts, and filed for an expedited divorce. Trent was practically vibrating with rage and severe financial desperation. He marched right up to the edge of my property line, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You think you are so smart, you old fool," Trent yelled, his voice cracking with pure, unhinged panic. "I know Julian is completely broke. I know you are the only one holding the deed to those 5 acres of prime commercial land. My development company needs that land to survive this divorce right now. You have until Tuesday. Harper told me she is getting the legal conservatorship approved by the judge next Tuesday morning." I stood perfectly still on my driveway, letting his desperate threats wash over me like a warm summer breeze. Trent took a step closer, his face turning bright red with malice. "The exact minute your daughter-in-law gets the legal right to sign your property over to me, I am going to bring a massive bulldozer right to this curb," Trent sneered, spitting slightly as he spoke. "I am going to personally level this piece of trash historic house to the dirt. I am going to pave over your entire pathetic life and build a parking lot on top of it. And you will be locked away in a padded cell too heavily medicated to even remember your own name." He stood there breathing heavily, waiting for me to cower. He wanted me to beg. He wanted me to show fear. But a man who has poured concrete and bent steel his entire life does not bow to a broken, desperate bully. I looked Trent dead in the eye. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I let a slow, cold smile spread across my face. It was the smile of an architect watching a man arrogantly dance on a collapsing roof. "That sounds like a very ambitious plan, Trent," I said, my voice dropping to a low, terrifying register. "Just do me one small favor before you bring that bulldozer to my property. Make absolutely sure you buy a comprehensive life insurance policy first." Trent froze completely. The angry color drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He recognized the absolute, unforgiving danger in my eyes. I turned my back on him and walked slowly up my front steps, unlocking my heavy oak door. The pieces were officially in place. The final countdown had begun, and the storm that was coming on Tuesday would wash all of them away. A man who spends his entire life pouring concrete and welding heavy steel beams knows one fundamental truth about survival. The most important part of any massive structure is the part that nobody ever sees: the foundation. While my arrogant neighbor Trent and my foolish son Julian were busy buying flashy sports cars and wearing custom Italian suits to prove their worth to the world, I was quietly burying my wealth deep underground where no one could ever touch it. 15 years ago, long before the greedy white woman named Harper ever dug her venomous claws into my son, I walked into a high-rise law office and made the most important financial decision of my life. I established an ironclad, irrevocable trust. I did not name my son as the primary beneficiary. Even back then, I could see the microscopic cracks forming in his character. I saw his inherent weakness for easy money, his dangerous gambling habits, and his desperate, pathetic need for external validation. I knew that if I handed him a fortune, he would burn it to ash. Instead, I named the only person in my life who had ever shown true, unwavering integrity: my goddaughter Kendra. An irrevocable trust is exactly what it sounds like. Once an asset is placed inside that legal vault, it no longer belongs to the individual. It belongs entirely to the trust. It cannot be seized by angry creditors. It cannot be touched by federal lawsuits, and it absolutely cannot be liquidated by a desperate daughter-in-law waving a forged power of attorney in a courtroom. We had exactly 3 days until the federal court hearing. 3 days to completely empty the vault before the bank robbers arrived at the front door. Working with my attorney Vance was like watching a master surgeon perform a highly complex lethal operation. We operated entirely in the shadows. We did not alert any of the local bank branch managers. We used encrypted digital channels and private wealth administrators who answered directly and exclusively to Vance. I sat in his immaculate corner office overlooking the sprawling Atlanta skyline and signed my name over and over again. With every stroke of my pen, I was dismantling the empire my enemies were trying to steal. I legally transferred the deed to my historic brownstone directly into the trust. I transferred the pristine title to the 5-acre commercial property that Trent was so desperately relying on to save his collapsing real estate company. Every single piece of valuable real estate, every diverse stock portfolio, every high-yield mutual fund was quietly and meticulously swept off the board. Then came the liquid cash. We ruthlessly drained the massive checking and savings accounts that Julian thought he was about to inherit. I watched the numbers on Vance's computer screen drop rapidly from millions, down to thousands, down to hundreds. I told Vance to stop the transfer when the balance hit exactly $5. Vance looked at me and offered a dark, predatory smile. "Just $5, I confirmed, nodding slowly. I wanted Harper to go through the massive trouble of bribing a corrupt doctor, forging federal medical documents, and humiliating herself in a federal courtroom just to win enough money to buy a single cheap cup of black coffee. By Monday evening, I was officially a financial ghost. On paper, Desmond Wright owned absolutely nothing. If you looked at my public financial profile, I was a completely destitute 72-year-old man living on the edge of poverty. But in reality, I had become an invisible fortress that could never be breached. The night before the trial, my historic brownstone was incredibly quiet. The heavy silence echoing through the hallways was not lonely. It was the cold, peaceful silence of a battlefield right before the heavy cannons start firing. I walked upstairs to my master bedroom and laid out my tailored charcoal suit on the mattress. I polished my dark leather shoes until they shined like glass. I wanted to look my absolute best when I watched my only son burn his own life to the ground. I walked down to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of cold water. I stood by the sink looking out the window into the dark street, thinking about the sheer, blinding audacity of what they were trying to do. They genuinely believed that tomorrow morning a federal judge was going to strip away my basic human rights and hand the keys to my kingdom directly to them. They were probably sitting in a luxury hotel room right now, drinking expensive champagne paid for by the money they stole from my retirement account, aggressively celebrating a victory that was never going to happen. As I stood in the dark kitchen, my cell phone began to vibrate violently on the marble countertop. The glowing screen illuminated the dark room. It was Julian, my son, the man who had forged my signature to steal my life and cover his massive underground gambling debts. I let the phone ring 4 times before I finally picked it up. I did not say hello. I just pressed the cold glass to my ear and listened to his heavy, uneven breathing. Dad Julian said, his voice trembling violently. He was crying. Or at least he was putting on the most pathetic theatrical performance I had ever heard in my entire life. He was desperately trying to play the role of the heartbroken, dutiful son who was being forced by tragic circumstances to make a terrible medical decision for his father. "Dad, please just listen to me for 1 minute," Julian begged, his voice cracking with manufactured sorrow. "I am doing all of this for your own safety. Your mind is slipping, Dad. You are getting aggressive with people. Harper and I are just terrified that you are going to get hurt or burn the house down. We love you so much. We just want you to be safe." He paused, waiting for me to say something, waiting for me to validate his disgusting lies. I remained perfectly silent, letting him drown in the empty space on the line. "Please, Dad," Julian whimpered, playing his final emotional card. "When we get to the courthouse tomorrow, just let it happen. Do not fight us. Do not make a crazy scene in front of the judge. Just let me take care of you. It is for your own good. I promise I will visit you in the facility every single week." I listened to the wet, pathetic sound of his fake tears. He was gaslighting me over the phone. He wanted me to surrender quietly so he would not have to face the overwhelming guilt of looking me in the eyes while he ruined my life and sold my land to Trent. He wanted easy absolution for his federal crimes. I took a slow, deep breath. The last remaining ember of paternal warmth in my chest was completely extinguished entirely, replaced by a cold, unforgiving, and absolute void. "Tomorrow, Julian," I said, my voice dropping to a dark, lethal whisper that cut straight through his fake crying. "You will die, and you will not even have a grave to hide in." I ended the call and turned off the phone. The trap was fully set. The execution was officially scheduled for 9 in the morning. The morning sun glared off the towering glass and concrete architecture of the Atlanta Federal Courthouse. I walked up the wide granite steps, feeling the familiar heavy weight of my polished steel-toed boots against the stone. I wore the dark charcoal suit I had meticulously pressed the night before. Beside me walked Vance, my attorney. He looked like an absolute executioner in his tailored midnight blue suit, carrying a sleek black leather briefcase that held the nuclear codes to my son's entire existence. We pushed through the heavy oak doors of courtroom number 4 and walked down the center aisle. The air inside was cold, sterile, and smelled faintly of floor wax and impending doom. We took our seats at the defense table. Directly across the aisle sat Julian and Harper. They had clearly spent the entire morning curating their costumes for this performance. Harper had completely ditched her usual flashy designer labels and excessive expensive jewelry. She wore a drab, modest gray dress that buttoned all the way up to her collarbone. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a simple, messy bun, and she wore absolutely no makeup, purposely making her skin look pale and deeply exhausted. She was playing the role of the battered, terrified caregiver to absolute perfection. Julian sat next to her, slumping in his chair, rubbing his bloodshot eyes to project the image of a heartbroken son forced to make an impossible choice against his own father. The bailiff ordered the room to rise as Judge Sterling entered the courtroom. Judge Sterling was a legendary figure in the federal circuit. He was a stern, older white man with perfectly slicked-back silver hair and a notorious reputation for handing down maximum sentences without a single flinch. He sat heavily behind his elevated mahogany bench, adjusted his reading glasses, and stared down at the courtroom with pale, unforgiving eyes. Harper's high-priced corporate lawyer stood up to begin the proceedings. He was a slick, fast-talking attorney who looked at Vance and me with a thinly veiled smirk of absolute superiority. He buttoned his expensive suit jacket and walked confidently to the center podium to deliver an opening statement designed solely to assassinate my character in front of the federal magistrate. "Your Honor." The lawyer began, his voice dripping with manufactured sorrow. "We are here today because of a profound and heartbreaking tragedy. The man sitting at the defense table, Donovan Wright, was once a hard-working, honorable citizen, but the cruel passage of time has completely destroyed his mind. He is no longer the man he used to be. He has become a severe, unpredictable danger to himself and most tragically to his own family. We are asking this court to grant an immediate permanent conservatorship to his son, so we can place Mr. Wright in a secure psychiatric facility before his violent delusions result in a fatal tragedy." I sat completely motionless. I did not shake my head. I did not scowl. I let the lawyer fill the silent courtroom with his disgusting, theatrical lies. He turned back to his table and called Harper to the witness stand as his primary source of evidence. Harper stood up slowly, gripping a crumpled white tissue in her trembling hands. She walked to the witness box, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore a holy oath to tell the whole truth. It was a spectacular display of absolute blasphemy. She sat down, looking up at Judge Sterling with wide, tear-filled eyes, acting like a woman pushed to the absolute brink of human endurance. "Mrs. Wright," her lawyer asked gently, leaning against the wooden railing, "can you please explain to the court what it has been like living with your father-in-law over these past few agonizing months?" Harper brought the tissue to her nose, letting out a soft, rehearsed sob. "It has been a living hell," she whispered, her voice shaking beautifully. "We have tried everything to care for him. We love him so much. But his mind is completely gone. Your Honor, he does not recognize us half the time. He thinks he is still living in the 1980s. Can you give the court some specific examples of this behavior?" the lawyer prompted, making sure to guide her directly into the script they had rehearsed. Harper nodded, letting a single tear roll down her pale cheek. "It is the hygiene, Your Honor. It is so degrading to even talk about. He refuses to bathe for weeks. He wanders the hallways in the middle of the night completely disoriented, and he urinates all over the hardwood floors. I spend hours every single morning scrubbing the house on my hands and knees just to keep it sanitary, but he just screams obscenities at me when I try to help him clean himself. A low murmur of disgust and deep sympathy rippled through the gallery of spectators behind me. I felt my jaw tighten just a fraction of an inch. Claiming that a proud black man who had built half the commercial foundations in this city was wandering around filthy and relieving himself on the floor was the ultimate unforgivable insult. She was intentionally trying to strip away every single ounce of dignity I had earned over 72 years of hard labor. But I remembered Vance's strict instructions. I remained as still as a stone statue, locking my eyes straight ahead. "But that is not the worst part," Harper cried out, her voice suddenly rising in pitch, sounding genuinely hysterical. "The delusions are getting incredibly violent. Last week I walked into the kitchen to make breakfast and he was just standing there in the dark. His eyes were completely blank, like looking at a dead person. My husband Julian came down to check on us and Donovan just snapped. He grabbed an 8-inch butcher knife from the counter. He came at my husband with a knife. He cornered his own son against the refrigerator, swinging the blade and screaming that we were home invaders trying to murder him." She covered her face with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably into the courtroom microphone. Her shoulders shook with manufactured trauma. "We live in constant fear, Your Honor. We have to lock our bedroom door at night and sleep with a heavy chair pushed against the frame. I am terrified that if he is allowed to return to that house, he is going to slaughter us in our sleep. He is completely insane. He cannot be trusted to live in society for one more day." The entire courtroom gasped in collective horror. Several people in the spectator benches shook their heads, looking at me with pure terror and absolute pity for the weeping white woman on the stand. They looked at me as if I were a rabid dog that had somehow slipped off its leash. Harper's lawyer let the dramatic weight of her testimony hang in the air for a long, agonizing moment. He turned his back to the judge and looked directly at me. He flashed a brilliant, arrogant smirk, fully convinced he had just driven the final nail into my coffin. He thought he had completely won the judge over with this pathetic sob story. "No further questions." "Your Honor," the lawyer announced, returning to his seat. "Given the extreme documented threat of physical violence and severe cognitive failure, we request that you strip Donovan Wright of his civil rights immediately and grant full emergency conservatorship to his son today." The courtroom buzzed with sympathetic whispers. Julian looked down at his hands, playing the part of the traumatized survivor perfectly. Harper continued to weep softly in the witness box, believing she had just successfully stolen my multi-million-dollar real estate portfolio with a few fake tears and a well-delivered script. I did not move. I sat there in my tailored suit, staring straight ahead, breathing slowly and rhythmically. Vance sat beside me, equally unbothered, casually clicking his expensive fountain pen against his legal pad. They thought they had trapped a wild animal in a cage. They thought they were the smartest people in the room. They had absolutely no idea that they had just committed multiple counts of federal perjury right in front of one of the most ruthless judges in the state of Georgia. They had built their entire case on a mountain of lies, and my lawyer was about to light the match that would burn it all to the ground. The courtroom was completely silent except for the faint sound of Harper sniffing into her crumpled white tissue. She had just delivered an Academy Award-winning performance. She painted me as a violent, filthy lunatic who chased my own son around the kitchen with a butcher knife. The spectators sitting in the wooden pews behind me were completely sold. I could feel their eyes burning into the back of my neck. They thought I was a monster. They thought Julian and Harper were the tragic victims of a rapidly decaying old man who needed to be locked in a cage for the safety of society. Judge Sterling looked down from his elevated mahogany bench. His face was a mask of pure judicial authority. He adjusted his silver-rimmed reading glasses and looked directly at our defense table. He asked my attorney if we wished to cross-examine the witness. Vance did not jump up eagerly. He took his absolute time. He casually clicked his expensive fountain pen closed and placed it precisely parallel to his yellow legal pad. He stood up slowly, smoothing the front of his tailored midnight blue suit. He walked toward the center podium with the calm, lethal grace of a predator that had already cornered its prey. He did not look angry. He looked mildly curious, which I knew from experience was when he was at his absolute most dangerous. Mrs. Wright Vance began, his voice smooth as glass but carrying perfectly across the large room. "You have just given this court a very disturbing account of my client's mental state. You swore under oath that he is violently unstable, deeply confused, and entirely incapable of managing his own life or his substantial real estate portfolio. Harper lifted her chin. Her confidence was fully restored now that she was the center of attention again. "Yes," she answered, putting a slight theatrical tremble in her voice. "That is exactly what I am saying. It has been a living nightmare for Julian and me. We are absolutely terrified of him." Vance paced slowly in front of the witness box, the sharp click of his leather shoes echoing off the polished floor. So terrified that you felt the only possible solution was to completely strip this man of his basic human rights. You want this federal court to believe that Donovan Wright, a man who safely and successfully managed million-dollar commercial construction sites across this city for 40 years, cannot even remember how to use a bathroom. Harper shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Her mask of the fragile victim was starting to slip just a fraction of an inch as her natural, ugly arrogance flared up. She hated being questioned. She especially hated being challenged by a highly educated, confident black man who was completely immune to her fake tears. "I do not care what he built 40 years ago," Harper snapped, her voice rising in pitch and losing its fake sweetness. "I care about what he is doing right now in my house." Vance stopped pacing. He turned on his heel and looked Harper dead in the eyes. "In your house. Let the official record reflect that the historic property in question is owned solely and entirely by Donovan Wright. But moving on to your claim of physical violence, you testified that my client chased your husband with an 8-inch butcher knife. That is a terrifying scenario, Mrs. Wright. I assume you immediately dialed 911 and filed a police report for aggravated assault." Harper froze. She looked over at her expensive corporate lawyer, but he was staring down at his notes. She swallowed hard, gripping the wooden edges of the witness stand. "Well, no, we did not call the police," she stammered. "We did not want to put him in a jail cell. We just wanted to get him medical help." Vance let out a short, dry laugh that cut through the tension in the room like a razor blade. "You were terrified for your lives, sleeping with a heavy chair pushed against your bedroom door, but you did not call the police. That is fascinating. Let us talk about what you actually did instead." Vance pressed on relentlessly. He asked her to describe the layout of the kitchen where the supposed knife attack took place. He asked her why Julian, who was 30 years younger than me, could not simply disarm a fragile elderly man. He asked her why the medical records from my primary care physician from just 2 months ago showed a perfectly healthy cognitive score. Harper stumbled over her answers. She contradicted herself twice within 5 minutes. Her breathing grew shallow. She was not used to being interrogated. She was used to people blindly believing her wealthy aesthetic and her dramatic crying. Vance stepped closer to the podium. His voice dropped to a low, conversational tone that somehow felt more intimidating than a shout. "Mrs. Wright, my client, built his home from the dirt up. He has lived a life of quiet dignity, and yet you come into this federal courtroom and paint a picture of a filthy, violent lunatic. Is it possible, Mrs. Wright, that your perception of his mental state is heavily influenced by your own severe financial desperation?" "Objection!" the opposing lawyer shouted, jumping up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Calls for speculation. Counsel is harassing my client." Overruled. Judge Sterling barked instantly, waving his hand dismissively. "The financial motive is highly relevant to a conservatorship petition. The witness will answer the question." Harper glared at Vance, her eyes burning with pure venom. "We are not desperate," she hissed, gripping the wooden railing tightly. "My husband runs a highly successful technology startup. We have plenty of our own money. We are simply trying to do the right thing for a sick old man." Vance let out a soft, chilling laugh. "A highly successful startup. That is a very interesting description for a company that has not turned a single dollar of profit in 3 years. Tell me, Mrs. Wright, if you are so financially secure, why did you attempt to secretly sell my client's 5-acre commercial property to your neighbor Trent yesterday afternoon? Why did you draft a secret contract to liquidate his land for $2.5 million, the exact same amount your husband happens to owe in underground gambling debts?" Harper gripped the wooden railing so hard her knuckles turned completely white. Her face flushed a deep, angry red. The trap was closing around her, and she could feel the steel teeth biting into her skin. She lost her temper completely, forgetting the fragile act, forgetting the stern judge sitting right next to her, forgetting everything except her blinding hatred for me and her desperate panic. She stood up slightly, leaning over the witness box, and pointed a shaking manicured finger directly at my face. "He is a batshit crazy old man," Harper screamed, her voice tearing through the quiet courtroom like a jagged blade. "He has lost his mind. He cannot be trusted with a single dime of his own money or a single decision in his life. He needs to be locked away before he ruins everything." The crude, hateful words echoed off the high vaulted ceilings. The gallery behind me gasped in collective shock. At the petitioner table, her lawyer buried his face in his hands, realizing his client had just completely shattered the sympathetic victim illusion he had worked so hard to build. Harper glared at me, breathing heavily, her chest heaving with triumphant rage. She thought she had won. She thought that shouting me down and embarrassing me in a federal courtroom was the final nail in my coffin. She thought she had established absolute dominance. Then came the sound that stopped her heart. A single, incredibly sharp crack of a wooden gavel. Bang! Judge Sterling leaned far forward over his elevated mahogany bench. The stern, patient demeanor he had maintained throughout the entire morning had completely vanished. His jaw was set like granite. His pale eyes were narrowed into cold, sharp slits. The courtroom fell so incredibly silent you could hear the subtle hum of the air conditioning vents. Judge Sterling did not look at the defense lawyer. He did not look at my son Julian, who was now shrinking down in his seat. He locked his furious, unforgiving gaze directly onto Harper's pale face. "Are you absolutely sure you want to continue with these accusations under oath?" Judge Sterling asked, his voice rumbling through the room like distant thunder. The question hung in the air, heavy and lethal. Harper froze instantly. The aggressive, arrogant fire in her eyes flickered and died out in a fraction of a second. She looked around the room in pure, unadulterated confusion. She looked over at her expensive lawyer, but he was staring down at his legal pad, his smug confidence entirely evaporated. He would not even make eye contact with her. "What do you mean?" Harper stammered, her voice shrinking back down to a pathetic, terrified whisper. "I am telling the truth." Judge Sterling did not blink. He did not break eye contact with her for a single second. "You are under oath in a federal court of law," he continued, his tone absolutely ruthless. "Perjury is not a minor mistake. It is not a slap on the wrist. It is a federal felony. Defrauding this court in an attempt to seize an elderly citizen's estate is a severe, punishable crime. I will ask you one last time, and I strongly suggest you think about your answer very carefully. Do you stand by the claim that this man is incompetent and violently unstable?" Harper swallowed hard. The color completely drained from her face. She looked like a ghost standing trapped in the witness box. Her arrogance was replaced by the terrifying realization that the ground beneath her was giving way. But she was in too deep. She had already bet her entire life and her husband's life on this massive lie. She managed a weak, trembling nod. "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Sterling leaned back in his heavy leather chair. "Very well," the judge said flatly, his tone signaling that he was done showing any mercy. "Counselor Vance, you may proceed with your cross-examination." The entire courtroom held its collective breath. The silence was absolute and suffocating. Vance did not say a word at first. He simply turned around and walked slowly back to our defense table. He stopped right next to my chair. He looked down at the polished wooden floor and deliberately ground the heel of his expensive leather shoe against the hardwood, making a sharp, gritty sound that echoed perfectly in the quiet room. It was the sound of a man preparing to crush an insect. Vance reached down to the table and picked up a single thick file folder. It was not a standard manila folder. It was a bright, stark blood red. He held it up slightly so the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom caught the vibrant color. It was the exact folder that held the toxicology reports, the forged bank documents, and the hidden audio transcripts. Harper stared at the bright red folder from the witness box. Her breathing became shallow and rapid. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably against the wooden railing. She had walked into this courtroom believing she was the predator holding all the cards. But as Vance smiled and turned back toward her, she finally realized the horrifying truth. She was not the predator at all. She was just the bait, and the jaws of the trap were about to snap shut. Vance did not even look at Harper as she stumbled out of the witness box. Her legs were weak. She practically collapsed into the wooden chair next to Julian at the petitioner table. The arrogant facade she had worn all morning was completely gone, replaced by a cold, paralyzing terror. Vance stood in the center of the courtroom holding the stark red folder. He looked up at the judge and announced that the defense would like to call Dr. Aris to the stand. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Dr. Aris walked down the center aisle. He was completely unaware of the absolute massacre that had just taken place. He wore a crisp, tailored suit, and carried himself with the supreme arrogance of a wealthy private physician who was used to his medical opinions being treated as absolute gospel. He walked right past my table without even glancing at me. He stepped into the witness box, placed his right hand on the Bible, and swore a sacred oath to tell the truth. He sat down and adjusted his expensive silk tie, offering Judge Sterling a polite collegial nod. Dr. Eris Vance began walking slowly toward the podium. You submitted a sworn medical affidavit to this federal court stating that you personally evaluated my client Donovan Wright last week. In your expert medical opinion, what is his current cognitive state? Dr. Eris cleared his throat and leaned into the courtroom microphone. He spoke with that same slow, patronizing tone he had used in my living room. I conducted a very thorough evaluation of Mr. Wright at his home. Unfortunately, he is suffering from severe late-stage cognitive decline. He was entirely disoriented during my visit. He did not know what year it was. He could not answer basic mathematical questions, and he appeared deeply agitated. In my professional medical opinion, he is completely unfit to manage his own estate and poses a significant danger to himself and his family. An emergency conservatorship is absolutely medically necessary. Vance nodded slowly, resting his hands on the edges of the wooden podium. You are absolutely certain of this diagnosis, Doctor? I have been practicing medicine for 20 years, Counselor Dr. Eris replied, a hint of annoyance creeping into his arrogant voice. I am absolutely certain. The signs of end-stage dementia are unmistakable. Vance opened the bright red folder. Dr. Eris, he said, his voice dropping into a deadly quiet register. Have you ever accepted financial compensation outside of standard medical billing procedures in exchange for falsifying a medical diagnosis? The opposing lawyer instantly jumped to his feet, shouting an objection. He claimed Vance was badgering the witness and making baseless, defamatory accusations. Judge Sterling held up a single hand, silencing the lawyer immediately. The judge looked down at Vance with a serious, narrowed gaze and warned him that he was walking a very dangerous line. The judge demanded to know if Vance had concrete evidence to support such a severe implication. I have much more than an implication, Your Honor, Vance replied smoothly, never taking his eyes off the doctor. I asked the court for permission to play Defense Exhibit A on the courtroom audio system. Judge Sterling granted permission with a sharp nod. Vance handed a small digital storage drive to the court clerk. He turned back to the witness box. You see, Dr. Eris, Vance explained, pacing slowly across the floor. My client spent the last decade of his career as an elite security engineer for high-stakes casinos. When you and Mrs. Wright sat in his living room discussing how to legally steal his life, he decided to serve you tea. What you failed to notice was the microscopic digital audio recorder he had taped directly under the silver tray resting just inches from your hands. Dr. Eris went completely rigid in the witness box. The arrogant color drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. He gripped the edges of the wooden stand, staring at the audio speakers in absolute paralyzing horror. The courtroom speakers clicked and hummed to life. At first there was only the sound of a door closing and footsteps walking away. And then the crystal-clear audio filled the silent courtroom. Everyone heard Harper's voice drop into a harsh, urgent whisper asking if the evaluation was enough for the judge. They heard Dr. Eris laugh, a dry, arrogant sound confirming that I was completely detached from reality. They heard Harper explicitly demand that he write the official medical report saying I had end-stage Alzheimer's so they could get the conservatorship approved by Tuesday. And finally, the entire courtroom heard the unmistakable heavy rustle of a thick paper envelope sliding across a table, the sound of a cash bribe being handed over to a licensed medical professional to destroy an innocent man's life. The gallery erupted into a low, scandalous murmur. People gasped out loud. Judge Sterling banged his heavy wooden gavel twice, demanding order, but his own face was flushed with pure, unadulterated fury. He glared down at Dr. Eris with a look that could melt solid steel. But Vance was not finished. He waited for the room to quiet down before he delivered the final fatal blow. Vance reached into the red folder and pulled out a single sheet of heavy certified paper and a small plastic evidence bag containing an amber pill bottle. If the audio recording of medical extortion is not sufficient for this court, Vance announced, his voice ringing out like a judge reading a death sentence, we also have physical evidence of a much darker crime. Please direct your attention to Defense Exhibit B. Vance walked over and handed the certified paper directly to the judge. Your Honor, this is an expedited, notarized report from an independent toxicology laboratory. The report details the chemical composition of the pills inside this amber bottle. A bottle that Dr. Eris personally handed to Harper Wright, instructing her to grind the pills up and put them in my client's morning coffee. Dr. Eris was sweating profusely now. Large beads of perspiration rolled down his forehead and soaked into the collar of his expensive dress shirt. His breathing was shallow and rapid. He looked like a man having a massive panic attack right there on the stand. Dr. Eris told my client's daughter-in-law that these pills were a mild daily vitamin supplement. Vance continued, turning his lethal gaze back to the witness box. But the toxicology report confirms they are actually a highly potent prescription antipsychotic sedative. This specific medication carries a severe black box warning. It is strictly banned for elderly patients. The toxicologist certified that if a healthy 72-year-old man were to ingest this dosage every morning, it would induce severe visual hallucinations, violent muscle tremors, and irreversible brain damage within days. The entire courtroom fell dead silent. The gravity of the accusation hung heavy in the cold air. "You were not just falsifying paperwork," Dr. Eris Vance roared, his voice echoing off the high ceilings like thunder. "You were instructing a woman to chemically lobotomize an elderly man. You were handing her the exact weapon she needed to destroy his brain so he would look insane when the court evaluators arrived. This is not just medical fraud. This is a premeditated, coordinated attempt at fatal poisoning." Dr. Eris opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked desperately at Harper's lawyer, but the slick corporate attorney was staring at the ceiling, completely abandoning the sinking ship. Dr. Eris swallowed hard, his entire body shaking violently against the wooden railing. He leaned into the microphone, his voice breaking into a terrified, pathetic whisper. On the advice of legal counsel, Dr. Eris stammered, wiping sweat from his eyes. "I decline to answer that question on the grounds that my answer may incriminate me." He was pleading the Fifth Amendment. He was openly admitting his guilt in front of a federal magistrate. Judge Sterling did not just look angry, he looked absolutely lethal. The judge stood up behind his elevated bench, his black robe billowing around his broad shoulders. He pointed a long, furious finger directly at the witness box. "I will not tolerate medical corruption, extortion, and attempted murder in my courtroom," Judge Sterling roared, his voice booming like a cannon. "The medical affidavit submitted by this disgraceful individual is immediately stricken from the official record. Bailiffs, take this man into custody right now. Hold him in the federal courthouse detention center pending a full investigation by the authorities." Two large armed court bailiffs immediately marched down the center aisle. They stepped right up to the witness box, grabbed Dr. Eris by his expensive suit jacket, and hauled him roughly to his feet. The cold, sharp sound of heavy metal handcuffs clicking and locking securely around the doctor's wrists echoed perfectly through the silent courtroom. Dr. Eris did not fight back. He kept his head bowed in absolute disgrace as the bailiffs marched him away. The man who had walked in acting like a king had just been dragged out like a common criminal. I turned my head very slowly and looked across the aisle at the petitioner table. Harper was sitting completely frozen. She was trembling so violently that her wooden chair rattled audibly against the hardwood floor. She gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady herself, but she looked like she was going to completely pass out. She had tried to poison my coffee and lock me in a cage, but now the doctor she hired to build that cage was wearing federal handcuffs, and Vance was slowly turning his attention directly toward her. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung completely shut behind the disgraced doctor, leaving a suffocating vacuum of silence in their wake. Harper was slumped in her chair at the petitioner table, shivering as if she had been plunged into freezing water. Julian sat beside her, staring blankly at his own hands, completely paralyzed by the catastrophic turn of events. They had walked into this federal building believing they were untouchable, but my attorney Vance was systematically dismantling their entire universe brick by brick. And we were not even close to being finished. Vance stood at the center podium, looking completely unbothered by the fact that he had just sent a licensed medical professional away in federal handcuffs. He smoothed the lapels of his midnight blue suit and turned his attention to the spectator gallery. "Your Honor," Vance said, his voice ringing out with absolute authority. "The defense would now like to call the petitioner's primary character witness to the stand. We call Trent to the witness box." Trent was sitting in the second row of the gallery. He stood up slowly, trying his absolute best to maintain his arrogant swagger. He was wearing an expensive gray suit, but his face was completely flushed, and a thin layer of sweat coated his forehead. He had just watched the doctor get arrested for perjury and attempted poisoning. He knew he was walking directly into a minefield, but he had absolutely no choice. He marched down the center aisle, placed his hand on the Bible, and swore the oath to tell the truth. He sat down in the wooden box, crossing his legs and trying to look like a completely innocent, concerned neighbor. "State your full name for the record," Vance commanded, not even looking up from his legal pad. Trent cleared his throat. "Trent Walker. I am the next-door neighbor." Vance nodded slowly, picking up a small black object from the defense table. He walked over and placed it carefully on the wooden railing of the witness box right in front of Trent. It was the military-grade GPS tracking device I had peeled off my classic Chevy pickup truck. Mr. Walker, Vance began, his tone dangerously quiet. "Can you tell this court what this object is?" Trent stared at the small black box. He swallowed hard, his arrogant posture stiffening. "I have absolutely no idea what that is." Counselor Trent lied, his voice tight and defensive. "It looks like a piece of plastic." Vance offered a cold, devastating smile. "It is a highly restricted military-grade geographic positioning sensor. My client, a retired casino security engineer, found this exact device magnetically attached to the undercarriage of his personal vehicle. We had the internal memory chip forensically analyzed yesterday. The digital footprint shows that the software was registered to a holding company that you personally own." The opposing lawyer jumped to his feet to object, but Judge Sterling immediately waved him down, leaning forward with intense interest. "Did you trespass onto my client's property in the dead of night to illegally plant a tracking device on his vehicle?" Mr. Walker, Vance asked, his voice rising with lethal precision. "Did you violate federal privacy laws to stalk an elderly man?" "I was just worried about him," Trent stammered, completely abandoning his previous denial. "Harper told me he was wandering. I was just trying to help the family keep track of him in case he got lost. I am a good neighbor." "A good neighbor," Vance repeated, mocking the phrase perfectly. "That is a fascinating defense for felony stalking. Let us talk about your neighborly concern. 3 nights ago, you called 911 and reported an emergency at the Starlight Motel located in the red light district. You told the police dispatcher that a severely demented senior citizen had stolen a car and was a danger to himself. Is that correct?" "Yes," Trent answered, sitting up a little straighter, believing he was finally back on safe ground. "Harper and I tracked his vehicle to that disgusting motel. We rushed over there with the police to save him. He was out of his mind. We were terrified he was going to get hurt." Vance let out a sharp, chilling laugh. "You rushed over to save him. You are truly a hero, Mr. Walker. Your Honor, the defense requests permission to display Exhibit C on the courtroom monitors. This is the official body camera footage subpoenaed directly from the police officers who responded to Mr. Walker's 911 call that evening." Judge Sterling granted the request immediately. The large flat-screen monitors mounted on the courtroom walls flickered to life. The entire courtroom leaned forward in their seats. The high-definition video filled the screens, showing the dark, cracked asphalt of the Starlight Motel parking lot. The flashing blue and red lights of the police cruiser illuminated the cheap brick exterior of room number 12. The audio from the body camera kicked in, filling the silent courtroom with the sound of Trent's own voice screaming obscenities in the dark. The video showed Trent pushing violently past the armed police officers. It showed him raising his heavy designer boot and kicking the cheap wooden motel door entirely off its hinges. The sound of the door splintering echoed loudly through the courtroom speakers. "I caught you, you crazy old fool." The digital version of Trent roared on the screen, storming into the room with Harper right behind him, holding her phone up to record the humiliation. But as the police flashlights swept across the interior of the dark motel room, the truth was finally and absolutely exposed to the light of day. There was no confused old man sitting in that room. Instead, the bright beams of light illuminated the dirty motel mattress, revealing 2 people desperately scrambling under the thin white sheets, trying to shield their naked bodies from the cameras. The courtroom erupted in a collective gasp of pure, absolute shock. The woman on the screen screaming and covering her face was Meredith, Trent's quiet, wealthy, and completely humiliated wife. And the man frantically trying to pull his pants up, the man caught directly in the glaring headlights of his own massive deception, was Julian, my son, Harper's husband. The video continued to play, showing the absolute catastrophic meltdown that followed. The entire courtroom watched in stunned silence as the digital version of Harper dropped her phone and launched herself onto the bed, screaming like a rabid animal, clawing at her husband's face. They watched Trent completely lose his mind, roaring in primitive fury and lunging forward to wrap his hands around his own wife's throat. They watched the police officers draw their tasers, shouting commands and physically tackling the arrogant real estate developer to the dirty carpet to stop him from committing murder right there in the motel room. Vance calmly tapped a button on his remote, pausing the video on a crystal-clear frame of Julian cowering in the corner of the room with a bloody, scratched face while Harper was being physically restrained by a police officer. Vance turned back to the witness box. "Well, Mr. Walker," he said, his voice dripping with absolute lethal sarcasm, "it appears you did not find a confused elderly man wandering the streets that night. It appears you simply kicked down a door to find your own wife intimately engaged with the very man sitting at the petitioner table today." The silence that followed was completely shattered by a sudden, unhinged scream from the petitioner table. Harper could no longer contain the absolute boiling rage inside her chest. The pristine, modest caregiver facade completely disintegrated into a million jagged pieces. She leaped out of her wooden chair, knocking it backward onto the floor. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at Julian's face, completely ignoring the federal judge, the armed bailiffs, and the packed gallery. "You pathetic, disgusting coward," Harper shrieked at the top of her lungs, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings like a siren. "You humiliated me. You dragged me into this courtroom to steal his money, and you were sleeping with that rich, desperate housewife the entire time. You ruined my life, you miserable excuse for a man." Julian threw his hands up to protect his face, shrinking away from his wife, sobbing hysterically right there in the middle of the federal courtroom. "I am sorry, Harper," he wailed, his voice breaking into a pathetic, miserable whine. It meant nothing. She meant nothing. From the witness box, Trent suddenly roared in fury. He slammed his fist down on the wooden railing, glaring at Julian with pure murderous intent. "I am going to kill you!" Trent screamed, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "I am going to tear your head off your shoulders, you broke, pathetic loser!" "Order," Judge Sterling roared, slamming his heavy wooden gavel down repeatedly with deafening force. "Order in this courtroom right now, or I will have every single one of you thrown into a holding cell for contempt." But the chaos was absolute. The grand theatrical illusion they had spent months building had completely violently shattered. The loving daughter-in-law, trying to protect her sick father-in-law, was exposed as an abusive, greedy monster. The concerned, heroic neighbor was exposed as an illegal stalker whose own wife despised him. The heartbroken son was exposed as a cheating, pathetic liar whose own wife was trying to tear him to pieces in front of a federal magistrate. I sat perfectly still at the defense table, my hands resting calmly on my lap. I did not smile. I did not laugh. I just watched the absolute glorious destruction unfold. They had brought me into this room to strip me of my dignity and lock me away. But instead I was sitting comfortably in the front row watching their entire arrogant world burn to the ground, leaving nothing but the humiliating ashes of their own miserable mistakes. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down against the sounding block again and again. Judge Sterling was practically vibrating with absolute judicial fury. The loud cracks echoed like gunshots over the hysterical screaming of my daughter-in-law and the pathetic sobbing of my son. Two armed bailiffs rushed forward and physically forced Harper back into her wooden chair. She was panting heavily, her chest heaving, her completely destroyed hair clinging to her sweaty, pale face. Julian was curled in on himself at the petitioner table, hiding his scratched and bleeding face in his hands. And Trent was standing in the witness box, gripping the wooden railing so hard his knuckles were bone white, glaring at Julian with pure, unadulterated murder in his eyes. "Order in this court!" Judge Sterling roared, his voice booming with such intensity that the entire room instantly fell into a terrified, suffocating silence. "One more outburst like that and I will hold every single one of you in criminal contempt and lock you in holding cells for the rest of the month. Do I make myself perfectly clear?" Harper sat rigidly in her chair, trembling violently. The fragile victim facade was completely dead and buried. She looked around the courtroom and saw the faces of the gallery staring back at her with absolute disgust. She had been exposed as a cheating, plotting, abusive fraud. She knew the conservatorship was dead. She knew she was facing federal prison time for the forged medical documents. But for a woman like Harper, greed is a terminal disease. It completely overrides any basic human instinct for survival or shame. She simply could not accept that she was walking out of this building empty-handed. She pushed herself up from the table, ignoring the stern warning glare from the armed bailiff standing directly behind her. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at me. "It does not even matter." Harper shrieked, her voice entirely stripped of any high society refinement. It was a raw, desperate scream. You can arrest the doctor. You can expose Julian for the pathetic, cheating coward he is. I do not care anymore. But that house still has to be sold. Julian owes $2.5 million to Trent's company. We are drowning in massive underground debt. We are his only family. We are his only legal heirs. We are legally entitled to that property to settle our debts. He is just a useless old man sitting on millions of dollars of equity while we lose everything. The absolute blinding audacity of her statement sent a fresh wave of horrified murmurs rolling through the courtroom gallery. She was standing in a federal courtroom moments away from being indicted for conspiracy and elder abuse, and she was still aggressively demanding my money. She openly admitted her entire motive right in front of the judge. She genuinely believed that because I was 72 years old, my life savings and my 5-acre commercial property were simply a rainy day fund meant to rescue her from her own disastrous choices. Judge Sterling was so furious he reached for his gavel to have her removed in handcuffs right then and there. But I did not want her removed. Not yet. I had not delivered the final killing blow. I placed my large, calloused hand gently on Vance's arm. My brilliant attorney looked at me, saw the cold, absolute resolve in my dark eyes, and offered a slow, knowing nod. He stepped back from the center podium, yielding the floor entirely to me. For the very first time since I had walked into that federal courthouse, I stood up. I did not use a cane. I did not hunch my shoulders. I did not let my hands tremble. I stood up to my full, imposing height, drawing on the raw, physical strength of a black man who had carried heavy steel beams and poured concrete foundations for 4 decades. I smoothed the lapels of my dark charcoal suit. I looked up at Judge Sterling, giving him a slow, respectful nod, and then I turned my gaze directly onto the frantic, greedy white woman who had made the absolute fatal mistake of underestimating my intelligence. If it pleases the court, I said, my voice rich, deep, and carrying the unmistakable heavy weight of absolute authority, I would like to directly address the petitioner's claim regarding my physical assets and my estate. Judge Sterling slowly lowered his gavel. He looked at me clearly, recognizing that the fragile, confused old man portrayed in their fake court filings had never actually existed. "The floor is yours, Mr. Wright," the judge said quietly. I reached down into my leather briefcase resting on the defense table. I pulled out a thick, heavy legal binder bound in dark blue leather. I did not hand it to Vance to present. I held it myself, letting Harper stare at it. "You have spent this entire morning and the last several months of your miserable life obsessing over the value of my historic brownstone and my commercial land." I began pacing slowly toward the center of the room. "You hired a corrupt doctor to poison me. You forced your weak husband to commit federal wire fraud. You lied under oath. You completely destroyed your marriage and risked spending the next decade of your life in a federal penitentiary, all because you wanted to seize control of a property you believe is worth millions." Harper stared at the blue binder in my hands. Her frantic breathing hitched. She could feel the ground opening up beneath her, but she was entirely powerless to stop it. I opened the binder and pulled out a single, beautifully embossed legal document bearing the official seals of the state. "But here is the ultimate tragedy of your blinding arrogance, Harper," I continued, my voice ringing out with brutal, absolute clarity. "You assumed that because I am an older black man who wears steel-toed boots and drives an old pickup truck, I was financially illiterate. You assumed I was just sitting on a massive pile of equity blindly waiting to die. But 5 years ago, when I first noticed Julian hemorrhaging money to impress you and your high society friends, I took the necessary steps to protect my blood, sweat, and tears from predators exactly like you. I held the document up high so the entire courtroom could see the county seals stamped at the bottom. Even if you had successfully bribed the judge today, I said every word, striking her like a physical blow. Even if your forged medical power of attorney had been accepted, even if you had successfully drugged me and locked me in a psychiatric ward for the rest of my natural life, you would have inherited absolutely nothing." Julian lifted his head from his hands at the petitioner table. His bloodshot eyes widened in pure, unadulterated horror as he finally recognized the blue leather binder. 5 years ago, I declared, my voice booming across the silent room. I legally transferred the deed to my historic brownstone, the title to my 5-acre commercial property, and every single liquid asset I possessed into an ironclad, irrevocable, educational, and living trust. I am no longer the legal owner of that house or that land. The trust is. And the sole exclusive beneficiary of that multi-million-dollar trust is not my son. It is my goddaughter, Kendra." The silence that fell over the courtroom was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that follows a massive explosion. "You cannot touch a single dime of my money, Harper," I told her, staring directly into her terrified eyes. "You cannot sell a single brick of my house. There is not a single penny in my name for you to steal. You committed federal crimes, you destroyed your marriage, and you ruined your entire life to steal a ghost. You went to absolute war for an empty shell." Julian let out a guttural, agonizing groan from the petitioner table. He slumped forward, slamming his head against the wooden surface. He had forged documents. He had faced federal prison time. He had betrayed the father who loved him all to steal a house and land that had not belonged to me in half a decade. He had ruined his life for absolutely nothing. Harper physically staggered backward. The realization hit her with the brutal force of a freight train. Her knees completely buckled. She collapsed heavily into her wooden chair, staring blankly at the floor. The money was gone. It had always been gone. The massive $2.5 million debt hovering over her head was suddenly terrifyingly real, and her only escape route had just been completely bricked up and sealed shut. She was left with absolutely nothing but the ashes of her own greed. I stopped pacing. I stood perfectly still in the center of the courtroom. The destruction of my daughter-in-law and my son was completely finalized, but there was still one more rat trapped in the maze. I slowly turned my body and shifted my gaze toward the witness box. Trent was still sitting there, sweating profusely, his arrogant real estate developer persona completely shattered by the sheer magnitude of the legal massacre he had just witnessed. I looked him dead in the eyes, letting a slow, chilling smile spread across my face. It was the smile of the Grim Reaper coming to collect a heavy toll. "You have been threatening to break my son's legs over a massive gambling debt," I said, my voice dropping to a low, devastating whisper that carried perfectly to his ears. "You have been holding that $2.5 million debt over his head, forcing him to steal my land to pay you back." Trent swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing nervously. He gripped the wooden railing, bracing himself for whatever I was about to say next. "Do you really think Julian owes your shadow company $2.5 million? Trent?" I asked, the question hanging in the cold courtroom air like a loaded gun pointed directly at his chest. He had absolutely no idea that he had not just walked into my trap. He had built his entire arrogant life right on top of it. The heavy silence in the federal courtroom was absolute. Trent stared down at me from the elevated witness box. His arrogant face was completely pale and covered in a thick layer of nervous sweat. He swallowed hard. His expensive designer suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for his shrinking frame. He gripped the wooden railing so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. He had spent the last 4 years treating me like a pathetic, senile old man. He looked at my worn-out work boots and my classic Chevy pickup truck and assumed I was just a poor, uneducated bricklayer who got lucky with a piece of historic real estate. He thought he was the apex predator of our affluent neighborhood. He thought his flashy sports cars and his loud, expensive parties made him a king. But a true builder knows that a castle built on sand will always collapse the moment the tide rolls in. I did not break eye contact with him. I let the silence stretch out until the tension in the room was almost unbearable. I reached back into my heavy leather briefcase. I bypassed the blue folder that held my irrevocable trust. I bypassed the stark red folder that held the toxicology reports and the audio transcripts. Instead, I pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope secured with a thick black string. I walked slowly toward the center of the courtroom. I felt the eyes of every single person in the gallery burning into my back. Judge Sterling leaned forward over his mahogany bench. His pale eyes narrowed in deep fascination. My attorney Vance stood quietly by the defense table, a cold, predatory smile playing on his lips. He knew exactly what was inside that envelope. He was the one who helped me draft the execution orders. "You have been a very busy man, Trent." I began, my voice low and steady, echoing perfectly off the high vaulted ceilings. "For the last 10 years, you have been aggressively expanding your commercial real estate empire. You built flashy high-rise luxury apartments. You bought massive tracts of land. You walked around this city telling everyone you were a self-made multi-millionaire. You looked down your nose at people who actually worked with their hands. You even convinced my own foolish son to look up to you as a mentor." Trent opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He just stared at the heavy manila envelope in my hands, his breathing growing shallow and erratic. "But I know the absolute truth about your massive empire, Trent. I continued, pacing slowly back and forth. You are not a king. You are a desperate man drowning in a highly leveraged ocean of debt. Every single luxury building you ever constructed was funded by massive high-interest corporate loans. You never used your own money. You used your wife Meredith and her generational wealth as collateral to secure massive lines of credit. And when the traditional banks finally realized your debt-to-income ratio was a toxic liability, they cut you off completely. You were completely desperate for cash to keep your fraudulent empire afloat. So you turned to private anonymous lending institutions. I stopped pacing and stood directly in front of the witness box. I pulled a stack of heavily redacted financial documents from the manila envelope. I held them up so Trent could see the official corporate logos stamped at the top of the pages. For the last 6 years, your primary financial lifeline has been a private equity fund known as Iron Foundation Limited Liability Company. I announced, my voice ringing out with absolute devastating clarity. They are the primary lien holder on every single commercial property your company currently develops. They hold the massive multi-million-dollar mortgages on your high-rise apartments. They own the very ground you walk on, Trent. Trent nodded slowly, his eyes wide and completely terrified. Yes, he whispered, his voice trembling. They are my primary lenders. I pay my corporate mortgages to them every single month. But what does that have to do with Julian owing me money? I let out a low, chilling laugh that sent a visible shiver down his spine. It has absolutely everything to do with it, Trent. Because you see, a man who spends 40 years designing high-level casino security systems and managing massive commercial construction budgets does not just leave his money sitting in a standard savings account. He builds his own financial institutions. He creates his own private wealth management firms. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. Trent physically recoiled in the witness box, his jaw dropping open. I am the sole anonymous owner of Iron Foundation, Trent. I declared, my voice booming across the silent courtroom like a thunderclap. I am the man hiding behind the corporate veil. I am your primary lender. I am the bank. I own the massive mortgages on every single piece of real estate you claim to possess. You thought you were the wealthy tycoon terrorizing my family. You had absolutely no idea that you have been paying your corporate debts directly into my private bank accounts for the last 6 years. The gallery erupted into a frenzy of shocked gasps. Even the slick corporate lawyer representing my daughter-in-law dropped his expensive pen onto the table in pure disbelief. Judge Sterling sat back in his heavy leather chair, staring at me with a look of profound, absolute respect. I had not just defeated my enemies. I had secretly owned them the entire time. No, Trent gasped, shaking his head frantically. No, that is impossible. That is a massive corporate entity. You are just a retired contractor. You cannot be the primary shareholder. I am the only shareholder. Trent, I fired back, stepping even closer until I was looking directly up into his terrified eyes. And as your primary lender, I have been closely monitoring your corporate financial health. According to my certified ledgers, your development company has completely failed to make a single interest payment for the last 6 consecutive months. You are in massive, undeniable default. Trent gripped the wooden railing, his knuckles turning completely white. He was hyperventilating, now struggling to draw oxygen into his lungs. You stopped paying your corporate loans because your personal life was completely imploding, I explained, my tone turning to cold, unforgiving steel. You drained your company cash reserves to fight your wife Meredith in a brutal, expensive divorce. The very same divorce that was violently accelerated when you kicked down a motel door and caught her naked with my son. You bled your own company dry to save your own skin. And when you realized you were about to go bankrupt, you desperately tried to force Julian to steal my 5-acre commercial property so you could seize it and use the equity to pay off the debts you owed to my company. You tried to rob me to pay me back. Trent was completely paralyzed. He looked around the courtroom, desperately searching for a way out, but there were no exits left. He was trapped in a cage of his own making. But your grace period is officially over, Trent, I announced, holding up a final document bearing a bright red certified county seal. Yesterday afternoon, while you were busy preparing your fake testimony to lock me in a psychiatric ward, my attorneys officially activated the default clause on your entire portfolio. I filed the emergency foreclosure and corporate seizure documents with the federal bankruptcy court. I slapped the heavy documents down onto the wooden railing right in front of his trembling hands. As of 9 o'clock this morning, your entire real estate corporation has been legally seized, I told him, every word striking him like a heavy hammer. Your bank accounts are completely frozen. Your luxury properties are currently being locked down by federal marshals. You do not own a single brick, a single piece of land, or a single dollar. You are completely and utterly bankrupt. The arrogant white neighbor who had threatened to bring a bulldozer to my historic brownstone was entirely dead and gone. In his place sat a completely broken, ruined man. The sheer magnitude of his absolute destruction finally crashed down heavily upon him. He had tried to steal the land of an elderly black man to save his crumbling empire, and instead I had quietly, meticulously swallowed his entire world whole. Trent let out a terrible, agonizing gasp. He clutched his hands tightly over his chest, his face turning an alarming shade of pale gray. His eyes rolled back into his head. The weight of losing absolutely everything was too much for his heart to bear. He collapsed violently forward, slumping heavily over the wooden railing of the witness box, gasping desperately for air like a fish thrown onto dry land. The courtroom exploded into total chaos. The bailiffs rushed forward, calling urgently for medical assistance, but I did not move to help him. I stood perfectly still in the center of the room watching the tyrant fall. I had not just saved my home and protected my dignity. I had completely annihilated the baddest predator in the neighborhood, leaving absolutely nothing but dust in my wake. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung shut as the paramedics wheeled Trent away on a stretcher. He was clutching his chest, gasping for air, looking like a pathetic, broken shell of the arrogant real estate tycoon who had walked in just 2 hours ago. The gallery was completely silent. The only sound in the massive federal courtroom was the heavy, uneven breathing of my daughter-in-law. Harper was sitting at the petitioner table, shivering violently. Beside her, my son Julian was staring down at the polished hardwood floor, completely paralyzed by the catastrophic reality of their situation. Judge Sterling did not even watch Trent leave the room. He did not care about a bankrupt man having a panic attack. His pale, unforgiving eyes were locked entirely on Harper and Julian. The judge picked up his heavy wooden gavel, but he did not bang it against the sounding block. He held it tightly in his hand, pointing the polished wood directly at the two people who had tried to steal my life. This court has witnessed many terrible things over the years. Judge Sterling began, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous rumble that echoed perfectly off the high vaulted ceilings. I have presided over this bench for more than 2 decades. I have seen human greed. I have seen malice. I have seen families tear each other apart over money. But I have never in my entire professional career witnessed such a calculated, despicable, and thoroughly evil manipulation of the justice system. Harper swallowed hard, her pale throat working nervously. She opened her mouth to offer some kind of pathetic excuse, but the judge instantly raised his hand, silencing her before she could utter a single word. "You came into my courtroom," Judge Sterling roared, his voice booming with absolute judicial fury. "You stood under a holy oath and you attempted to legally assassinate a perfectly healthy, honorable man. You tried to strip away the constitutional rights of a citizen who spent his entire life building a legacy from the dirt up simply because you wanted to liquidate his existence to fund your own pathetic arrogance. You manufactured a crisis. You bribed a licensed medical professional to poison an elderly man. You are not just liars. You are incredibly dangerous predators." The judge paused, letting the heavy weight of his words crush them down into their seats. Julian squeezed his eyes shut, tears streaming down his face. He knew the hammer was about to fall, and there was absolutely nowhere left to hide. "The petition for emergency conservatorship is hereby dismissed with extreme prejudice," Judge Sterling announced, his words striking like physical blows. "You will never be allowed to file another legal motion regarding this man or his estate in any court in this country. But we are far from finished here today. This was not a simple domestic dispute. What you two have done constitutes a highly coordinated criminal conspiracy." Judge Sterling turned his head and looked directly at his court clerk. "Seal every single exhibit presented by the defense today," the judge commanded. "Impound the forged medical power of attorney. Impound the digital audio recordings, the toxicology reports, and the bank transaction logs showing the stolen $40,000. And I want you to contact the United States Attorney Office and the Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately." Harper suddenly gasped, her hands flying to her throat. Federal Bureau of Investigation. The words seemed to finally break through her thick wall of shock. She looked around the courtroom frantically, as if expecting to find a secret exit hidden in the wood paneling. "That is exactly right, Mrs. Wright," the judge said. His voice as cold as ice. "You and your husband have committed severe federal offenses. By emailing that forged document to the bank, you committed wire fraud across state lines. You conspired to commit medical fraud. You engaged in the bribery of a medical professional. You committed felony perjury right in front of me." and you have orchestrated the most aggressive documented case of elder abuse I have ever seen. You will not be walking out of the front doors of this courthouse today." Judge Sterling looked to the back of the room and gave a sharp, definitive nod. "Federal marshals, take the petitioners into immediate custody." 4 large armed federal officers stepped forward from the shadows of the gallery. They moved with swift tactical precision, their heavy boots thudding against the floor. 2 of the officers approached Julian. My son simply held his shaking hands out, surrendering completely to the overwhelming weight of his own massive failures. He wept openly, sobbing like a frightened child as the cold metal handcuffs snapped tightly around his wrists. But Harper did not surrender. When the federal marshal reached for her arm, the terrifying reality of her total destruction finally snapped her mind completely in half. The pristine, wealthy high society woman vanished entirely. She jerked her body away violently, knocking her heavy wooden chair backward onto the floor with a loud crash. "Do not touch me!" Harper shrieked, her voice tearing through the courtroom like a dying wild animal cornered in a trap. "You cannot do this to me. I am not going to jail. I have a life. I have a social standing. I am not a criminal. You cannot lock me up." The federal officers did not hesitate, and they did not show an ounce of mercy. They moved in seamlessly, grabbing her flailing arms and forcing them firmly behind her back. Harper fought them like a rabid beast. She kicked her expensive shoes against the polished floor. She twisted her body, screaming absolute nonsense, her perfectly styled blonde hair completely destroyed, hanging over her face in a sweaty, tangled mess. The sharp metallic click of the heavy handcuffs locking into place echoed perfectly through the massive room. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the absolute, undeniable sound of flawless justice. As the officers dragged her roughly away from the table, Harper locked her wild, furious eyes on me. The mask was completely gone. There was no fragile victim left. There was only a vicious, greedy monster who had been caught cleanly in her own trap. "You did this to me!" Harper screamed, her face bright red and distorted with pure, unadulterated hatred. "You ruined my life, you disgusting, crazy old man. I hate you. I will always hate you. You should have just died and left us the money. You should have just died." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I stood perfectly still in my tailored charcoal suit, looking at her with absolute, unwavering calm. "I built my house with brick and mortar, Harper," I replied softly, though my voice carried easily across the silent room. "You built yours on lies and stolen money. Do not blame me because your rotten roof finally caved in." The officers pulled her forcefully toward the side, holding doors. She continued to scream, kicking and fighting, cursing my name until the heavy wooden doors slammed shut behind her, cutting off her hysterical cries completely. The courtroom fell into a heavy, strange silence. I turned my attention back to the center of the room. Julian was still standing there, flanked by 2 federal marshals. His hands were cuffed securely behind his back. The expensive suit he wore looked like a cheap Halloween costume on a broken, pathetic boy. He looked at me, his eyes swollen and red, filled with a desperate, pathetic pleading. Suddenly, Julian dropped his weight and fell to his knees right there in the middle of the federal courtroom. The loud thud of his kneecaps hitting the hardwood floor echoed loudly. He completely ignored the officers standing over him. He dragged himself forward on his knees, inching across the floor until he was right in front of me. He leaned forward and wrapped his cuffed arms around my heavy steel-toed boots, burying his weeping face against my legs. "Dad, please." Julian sobbed, his voice breaking into a miserable, agonizing whine. "Please do not do this to me." I was desperate. I was so scared of Trent. "Harper manipulated me, Dad. You know she did. She poisoned my mind. I am your son. I am your only boy. Please, Dad. I am begging you. Forgive me. Please save me." I looked down at the weeping man kneeling on the floor. I searched my heart for any lingering trace of paternal warmth. I searched for the love I used to feel when I taught him how to ride a bicycle, or when I paid for his expensive college tuition. But the vault inside my chest was completely empty. He had burned it all to the ground the exact moment he forged my signature to steal my life and hand my legacy over to an arrogant white man. I did not bend down to comfort him. I did not place a loving hand on his shoulder. Instead, I slowly pulled my right leg back and kicked his hands away from my boots with a sharp, deliberate motion. Julian gasped, falling backward onto the floor, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. He finally saw the cold, unforgiving truth written clearly on my face. I looked him dead in the eye, my voice dropping to a low, terrifying whisper that carried the weight of 40 years of hard labor and absolute integrity. A black man never sells his own family to save his skin, Julian. I told him, my words cutting deeper than any knife. I only forgive men. You are just a parasite. I turned my back on him completely. I did not watch as the federal marshals hauled him roughly to his feet. I did not watch as they dragged my weeping, ruined son through the same heavy wooden doors his wife had just disappeared behind. I faced the front of the courtroom, my posture straight, my dignity entirely intact. The toxic, infected branches of my family tree had finally been completely amputated, and for the first time in years, I could finally breathe. 2 months have passed since the heavy wooden doors of the federal courthouse slammed shut, bringing an absolute and devastating end to the illusion of my family. The transition from the suffocating heat of summer to a bitter, freezing autumn brought a crisp, biting wind to the streets of Washington, D.C. The weather was blowing away the lingering stench of betrayal that had infected my historic brownstone for so long. Justice moves incredibly slowly in most regular cases, but when you hand the federal prosecutors a perfectly wrapped digital package of wire fraud, medical extortion, and attempted poisoning, they move with absolute terrifying speed. My house was finally quiet. It was not the heavy, anxious silence of a man waiting for an attack. It was the clean, breathing silence of a man who had successfully defended his fortress and slaughtered the wolves at his door. Let us talk about the absolute destruction of my arrogant white neighbor. Trent wanted to bring a massive bulldozer to my property and pave over my entire life. Instead, I brought a financial bulldozer to his. The federal bankruptcy courts showed him absolutely zero mercy. My private equity firm, Iron Foundation Limited Liability Company, systematically executed the foreclosure orders with ruthless mechanical precision. We liquidated every single commercial asset he had ever touched. His luxury high-rise apartment buildings were seized and auctioned off to the highest bidder for pennies on the dollar. His expensive sports cars were immediately repossessed by the banks. His quiet, wealthy wife, Meredith, finalized their expedited divorce, pulling her family money completely out of his reach, leaving him with nothing but a mountain of toxic corporate debt. The man who used to strut around our affluent neighborhood wearing custom-tailored polo shirts and reeking of expensive cologne was now completely destitute. I received a final closure report from my attorney Vance just last week. Trent is currently living in a weekly rental on the far industrial outskirts of the city. And it is not just any random cheap rental. By some brilliant poetic stroke of cosmic irony, he is renting room number 12 at the Starlight Motel. He is living in the exact same dingy roadside room where he kicked down the wooden door and found his wife naked in bed with my son. He wakes up every single morning staring at the stained carpet and the flickering pink neon light completely trapped inside the very walls where his fake, arrogant empire completely collapsed. And then there is Harper, my vicious daughter-in-law who genuinely believed she was the smartest and most untouchable predator in the room. She did not get to go back to my house and pack her expensive designer bags. She was denied bail entirely due to the extreme severity of the attempted poisoning charges and the undeniable flight risk she posed. She has been sitting in a cold concrete federal holding facility for 60 agonizing days. Her high-priced corporate lawyer dropped her case the exact second her credit cards bounced and her accounts were frozen. She was assigned a severely overworked public defender who sat her down in an interrogation room and told her the absolute brutal truth. She is currently facing a mandatory 7-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. There is absolutely no early parole in the federal justice system. The arrogant white woman who complained about the smell of my historic home is now forced to wear a stiff, scratchy, oversized orange jumpsuit. She eats scheduled, heavily processed meals off a divided plastic tray. I heard from the prosecutor's office that she spends her days weeping hysterically in the common room, begging the guards and the other inmates to believe that she was just a helpless victim of a crazy old man. But absolutely nobody cares. The heavy iron bars and the cold concrete floors do not care about her blonde hair or her high society tears. Her beauty and her manipulation have zero currency in a federal cage. I thought the trash had completely taken itself out. I thought I would never have to look at the pathetic wreckage of my family tree ever again. But a parasite always tries to return to its original host when it begins to starve. It happened on a dark Tuesday night. A massive violent rainstorm rolled into the city. The dark sky cracked open and the freezing rain came down in heavy punishing sheets, flooding the gutters and turning the asphalt streets into slick black rivers. I was sitting in my warm, comfortable living room reading a hardcover book and listening to the thunder rattle the window panes. Suddenly I saw a dark figure standing outside my property line. I walked over to the front window and looked out through the driving rain. Standing directly in front of my heavy wrought iron security gate was my son Julian. He did not have his expensive startup chief executive suits anymore. The federal authorities had frozen all of his assets pending his own upcoming criminal trial for wire fraud and conspiracy. He was wearing a thin, faded gray hooded sweatshirt that was completely soaked through, clinging tightly to his shivering, emaciated frame. His designer shoes were completely ruined, sinking deep into the muddy puddles forming on the edge of the sidewalk. He looked like a drowned, pathetic rat. He was gripping the cold iron bars of my security gate, staring up at my warm-lit windows, shivering violently in the freezing wind. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel the paternal urge to rush out and wrap a warm blanket around his shoulders. That specific part of my heart had been permanently surgically removed the day he forged my signature. I walked to the hallway closet and pulled out a large, solid black umbrella. I unlocked my heavy oak front door, stepped out onto the porch, and walked slowly down the long brick driveway. The heavy rain hammered aggressively against the top of my umbrella, but I stayed completely dry and untouched by the storm. I stopped on my side of the iron gate, looking through the metal bars at the miserable, broken man standing on the other side. "Dad." Julian whimpered, his voice incredibly fragile and barely carrying over the loud crash of the pouring rain. "Please, Dad, you have to let me inside. I have absolutely nowhere else to go. The federal agents took my apartment. They seized my bank accounts. My wealthy friends will not even answer my phone calls anymore. I have been sleeping in the back seat of my car for 3 days, and it is so incredibly cold out here tonight." He pressed his wet, scratched face against the cold iron bars, sobbing openly into the storm. "Please, just open the gate, Dad," Julian begged, his voice cracking with pure, pathetic desperation. "Give me one last chance to make this right. I know I was completely wrong. I lost my way. But I am your son. I will do anything you want. I will work for you. I will scrub the floors. Just let me come home. Please let me start over." I looked at his desperate, tear-streaked face. He was not apologizing because he felt genuine remorse for trying to steal my commercial land and lock me in a psychiatric ward. He was not sorry for the extreme pain he had caused. He was only apologizing because he had lost the game and he was suffering the severe consequences. He wanted a warm bed and a free meal. He wanted the father he had tried to completely destroy to magically fix his broken, ruined life. I reached into the pocket of my tailored trousers and pulled out my dark leather wallet. I opened it and extracted a single crisp $20 bill. I looked Julian dead in the eye, making sure he saw the absolute unforgiving void in my soul. I crumpled the green paper bill into a tight ball and tossed it casually right through the iron bars. The crumpled money landed in a dirty, muddy puddle right at his ruined, wet shoes. Julian looked down at the wet money and then back up at me, his face contorted in absolute confusion and crushing despair. "What is this?" he sobbed, wiping the freezing rain from his eyes. I stared at him with cold, unblinking eyes. "Buy a raincoat, Julian," I said, my voice dropping to a low, terrifying register that cut straight through the heavy storm with absolute, devastating finality. "Because your storm is just beginning." I did not wait for him to respond. I did not want to hear another pathetic excuse. I turned my back on him completely. I reached out and pulled the heavy iron lever, locking the security gate shut with a loud, definitive metallic clank. I walked slowly back up my brick driveway, returning to the warm, absolute security of my historic home. I left my traitorous, broken son standing in the freezing darkness alone with nothing but a wet $20 bill and the absolute agonizing reality of his own total destruction. The violent storms that had threatened to tear my life apart were finally completely gone, leaving behind a profound and absolute peace. The late afternoon sun was casting a warm, golden glow across the front porch of my historic Washington, D.C. brownstone. I sat in my favorite wooden rocking chair, the one I had carved and sanded by hand more than 30 years ago. I held a tall glass of sweet iced tea, the condensation dripping slowly down the side and pooling on the wooden armrest. Beside me sat my goddaughter, Kendra. She was not wearing her usual sharp investigative auditor suits today. She wore a comfortable linen shirt and had her hair pulled back, her brilliant mind completely focused on the large architectural blueprints spread wide across the heavy oak porch table. The neighborhood was incredibly quiet. The affluent streets that used to echo with the loud, arrogant engines of Trent's expensive sports cars were now filled only with the gentle rustling of the heavy autumn leaves and the distant, innocent laughter of children playing 2 blocks over. It was the exact kind of peace that you absolutely cannot buy with a black credit card. It is the kind of peace you have to fight for, the kind you have to defend with your bare hands and your absolute intellect. I took a slow sip of my iced tea and looked over at the blueprints Kendra was studying. We were looking at the architectural plans for the 5-acre commercial property located on the south side of town. That was the exact same piece of prime real estate that my son Julian and his greedy wife Harper had tried to steal from me. They wanted to liquidate my land to pay off a massive underground gambling debt and let Trent pave it over to build another soulless luxury high-rise apartment complex. But that land belonged entirely to the irrevocable trust I had established for Kendra. And Kendra, being the brilliant and fiercely loyal African-American woman that she is, had absolutely no intention of selling it to any corporate developers. Instead, we were going to build a fortress of our own. Kendra traced her finger along the blue ink of the schematics, explaining the layout to me. We were constructing a state-of-the-art legal aid and community protection center specifically designed for vulnerable senior citizens. It would be a place where elderly people who were being abused, manipulated, or financially drained by their own greedy families could come to get elite legal representation completely free of charge. We were going to hire ruthless attorneys just like Vance to stand up for the grandmothers and grandfathers who were being thrown away by a selfish generation. We were taking the very land that was supposed to be my graveyard and turning it into a massive, unbreakable shield for the entire community. I looked at Kendra, feeling an overwhelming wave of absolute pride swelling in my chest. "You have a true builder's mind, Kendra," I told her, my voice thick with genuine emotion. "You know exactly how to look at an empty plot of dirt and see a foundation that can hold the weight of 1,000 people. You are going to save a lot of lives with this building." Kendra stopped tracing the blueprints. She slowly rolled up the large architectural paper and set it aside. She picked up her own glass of iced tea and looked at me for a very long time. Her dark eyes were filled with a mixture of profound respect and lingering disbelief. "Uncle Donovan," she began, her voice dropping into a soft, serious tone, "there is something I have been wanting to ask you ever since that day in the federal courtroom. Something I just fundamentally do not understand about how you operate." I nodded slowly, leaning back in my rocking chair and gesturing for her to speak her mind. I told her there were absolutely no secrets left in this house and she could ask me anything she wanted. "How did you endure it?" Kendra asked, her brow furrowing in deep contemplation. "How did you sit at that dining room table week after week and listen to Harper insult you? How did you let Trent walk into your house and treat you like dirt? How did you sit in that courtroom while your own flesh and blood called you a crazy, filthy old fool in front of a federal judge? You are a proud black man who built half this city with your own 2 hands. How did you endure that level of sheer agonizing humiliation without completely losing your mind and tearing them apart on the very first day?" I took a long, slow breath, letting the cool, crisp autumn air fill my lungs. It was a profound question. It was the kind of question that requires a lifetime of hard, brutal lessons to properly answer. I looked out at the tall, sturdy oak tree standing in my front yard. I had planted that tree the very first week I bought this historic property. I had watched it weather countless hurricanes, blizzards, and devastating droughts without ever losing its grip on the earth. When you spend your entire life building skyscrapers and commercial foundations from the dirt up, I began, my voice steady and deeply resonant, you learn a very important and unforgiving lesson about structural integrity. When you are inspecting a building and you see that the load-bearing walls are completely rotten from the inside out, you do not stand underneath the collapsing roof and scream at the cracked concrete. You do not get angry at the drywall for failing. You simply step back, you secure your own perimeter, and you let gravity do all the heavy lifting. You let the corrupt structure completely collapse under the crushing weight of its own sheer arrogance. I looked back at Kendra, making sure she understood the absolute gravity of my words. Your cousin Julian and his wife built their entire lives on a rotten foundation of greed, deceit, and toxic vanity. They thought their expensive designer clothes and their leased luxury cars made them completely untouchable. But I knew the actual truth. I knew they were entirely hollow inside. If I had yelled at Harper, if I had thrown a violent tantrum, if I had reacted to Trent's pathetic insults, I would have been stepping right into their collapsing building. I would have given them exactly what they desperately wanted. I would have handed them the angry, erratic, out-of-control old man they needed to prove their fabricated medical narrative. Kendra listened intently, absorbing every single word like a dry sponge absorbing water. The silence of the elderly is not senility, daughter, I told her, delivering the absolute truth I had learned over 72 years of living. My silence was not confusion, and it certainly was not weakness. It is simply how we let fools dig their own graves deep enough so they can never climb back out. People, especially highly arrogant people, are absolutely terrified of pure silence. When you do not react to their constant provocations, they begin to panic. They start filling the empty space with their own massive mistakes. They get incredibly sloppy. They talk way too much. They leave digital trails. They hand you the exact weapons you need to destroy them. I let them vastly underestimate me because an underestimated man is the most dangerous person in any room on earth. Kendra squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, letting the profound weight of the lesson settle deep into her bones. She reached across the wooden table and placed her hand gently over my rough, calloused fingers. "I am so incredibly proud to be your daughter," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You protected everything. You protected us." I smiled, feeling a deep, radiating warmth spreading through my chest. I turned my gaze back out toward the quiet street. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the expansive city sky in brilliant, vibrant shades of crushed orange, deep purple, and burning gold. The streetlights began to flicker on, casting a warm, familiar glow across the neighborhood I had loved and defended for 4 decades. I sat back in my rocking chair, breathing in the cool, clean air of absolute total freedom. The war was officially over. My historic home was completely safe. My massive wealth was entirely secure in the trust. The enemies who had plotted in the shadows to steal my life were entirely swept away by the brutal consequences of their own actions. Trent was rotting in a cheap motel. Harper was locked in a federal cage. And Julian was wandering the cold streets completely stripped of his unearned pride. I had walked through the absolute darkest storm of betrayal, navigating the treacherous, toxic waters of human greed, and I had emerged on the other side completely victorious. I was a man who possessed a dignity that could never be stolen, a profound peace that could never be bought, and a true lasting legacy that would stand strong for generations to come. The changing of the seasons always brings a certain profound clarity to the streets of Washington, D.C. The harsh, brutal winds of winter eventually give way to the gentle, warming thaw of spring. My historic brownstone has seen dozens of these seasonal shifts, but none have ever felt quite as significant as this one. I wake up every single morning at 5 o'clock. I do not set a loud alarm. My internal clock was permanently forged by 4 decades of waking up long before the sun to pour heavy concrete and weld commercial steel. But these days I do not wake up to rush to a dusty, chaotic construction site. I wake up simply to enjoy the absolute total silence of a beautiful house that belongs entirely to me. I walk down the grand wooden staircase that I meticulously restored with my own 2 hands. I run my calloused fingers along the smooth mahogany railing. I step into my pristine kitchen, and I brew a strong pot of dark roast coffee. I sit alone at the heavy oak dining table. It is the exact same table where Harper once threw that insulting assisted living brochure right in my face. It is the exact same table where Julian sat staring at his expensive smartphone, silently agreeing that his own father was just a rotting piece of meat taking up valuable real estate. Today that table holds absolutely nothing but my morning newspaper, a hot, steaming mug of coffee, and the warm, golden sunlight streaming through the large bay windows. The toxic, suffocating presence of my greedy daughter-in-law and the pathetic, cowardly silence of my son have been completely and permanently eradicated from these walls. People often ask me how a father can actually do it. When I sit on my front porch and talk to the neighbors who watch the federal marshals haul my enemies away in handcuffs, they look at me with a mixture of profound respect and quiet, lingering fear. They wonder how a man can simply walk away from his own flesh and blood. They wonder how I can sleep so peacefully at night, knowing that my only biological son is wandering the freezing city streets completely stripped of his wealth, his dignity, and his entire future. It is a very heavy question. It is the kind of question that keeps a weaker man awake at night, staring blankly at the ceiling and second-guessing his own survival. But I am not a weak man. I am a master builder. And when you spend 40 years inspecting foundations, erecting load-bearing walls, and ensuring the structural integrity of massive skyscrapers, you learn a very brutal and unforgiving truth about the nature of decay. When you are inspecting a historic house and you find severe dry rot eating away at the main wooden support beam right in the center of the basement, you cannot negotiate with it. You cannot paint over the rotting wood to make it look pretty for the guests. You cannot just ignore it and pray to God that it magically heals itself over time. If you do not take a heavy saw and violently aggressively cut out every single inch of that infected wood, the rot will inevitably spread. It will climb up the interior walls. It will infect the ceiling joists. And eventually it will bring the entire massive structure crashing down directly onto your head, burying you in the rubble of your own denial. Julian and Harper were the rot inside my foundation. They were a deeply malignant infection born of pure, unchecked greed and blinding extreme arrogance. They were slowly and methodically eating away at the life and the legacy I had sacrificed my entire existence to build. Cutting my own son out of my life was the most agonizing, painful amputation I have ever had to perform. I remember teaching him how to throw a baseball in the backyard. I remember working 60-hour weeks to pay his expensive private college tuition. Erasing him from my heart hurt far more than carrying heavy steel beams up 3 flights of stairs with a bad back. It hurt more than any physical injury I ever sustained on a commercial job site, but it was absolutely unconditionally necessary. If I had let them stay, if I had forgiven them or handed over my hard-earned wealth to save them from their own disastrous financial failures, the infection would have completely destroyed us all. They would have sold my prime 5-acre commercial property to Trent for pennies on the dollar to cover a pathetic underground gambling debt. They would have pumped me full of heavy antipsychotic drugs until my brain completely melted. They would have locked me in a padded room to die alone while they drank expensive champagne in my living room. I had to sever the dead necrotic tissue to protect the parts of my family that were still healthy and full of brilliant, vibrant life. And that healthy, vibrant part is my brilliant goddaughter, Kendra. She is the true legacy of my blood, sweat, and tears. I talk to her every single week as she oversees the construction of the new legal aid center on the south side of town. The steel beams are already going up. The solid concrete foundation has been poured thick and unbreakable. She tells me about the elderly citizens in our community who are already reaching out for help, people who are being manipulated and financially drained by their own greedy children just like I was. We are going to provide them with the ruthless elite legal protection they need to defend their homes and their dignity. I listen to Kendra's voice filled with fierce passion and sharp intelligence, and I know without a shadow of a doubt that I made the absolute right choice. My wealth did not go toward funding Harper's luxury shoe collection or bailing out Julian's fraudulent debts. My wealth did not save Trent's collapsing, corrupt real estate empire. It went toward building a massive, unbreakable shield for the vulnerable. Kendra is the sturdy, unyielding steel beam that will carry our family name forward with actual, genuine honor. As for me, I am 72 years old, but my heart feels incredibly light. My shoulders are broad and my spirit is completely unbroken. I spend my afternoons reading on my front porch, waving to the neighbors who pass by. They know the quiet, unassuming black man on the corner does not tolerate disrespect, and he protects his territory with absolute terrifying precision. I do not harbor any lingering hatred for the people who tried to destroy me. Hatred is a very heavy burden, and I absolutely refuse to carry their toxic baggage for another second. I simply let them dig their own graves, and I stepped out of the way when the heavy dirt finally caved in. Blood makes you related, but loyalty, integrity, and respect make you family. When greed completely replaces love, the ties that once bound us quickly become the chains that suffocate us. Never let anyone, not even your own flesh and blood, mistake your quiet kindness for vulnerability or your silence for ignorance. A predator will always underestimate the profound strength of someone who has spent a lifetime building their foundation from the dirt up. In the end, the most powerful revenge is not anger. It is standing tall in your truth, securing your legacy, and patiently watching their own arrogance dig their grave. If this story resonated with you, please let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. Have you ever had to make the incredibly painful decision to cut ties with a highly toxic family member to protect your own peace and your own survival? Share your personal experiences with our community. Please hit the like button, share this video with someone who desperately needs to hear this message, and subscribe to the channel right now. Make sure you turn on the notification bell so you never miss another powerful story of truth, survival, and absolute justice. Thank you so much for listening, and remember to always protect your foundation.